Good evening, welcome to the Board of Selectmen's meeting for Monday, February 10th, 2020. We're going to start right off the meeting. We're not going into executive session. And before we do the Pledge of Allegiance, I'll run through it. 6:30 organization Pledge of Allegiance and reading of mail. 6:35 department and board updates, followed by number 4, public input and members updates. Around 7 o'clock, Affordable Housing Trustee appointment of Mark Montanari. Followed by item number 6 is fiscal year 2021 budget. Around 7:15, open the May 4th, 2020 town warrant. Followed by item number 8, which is municipal building space needs. 10 o'clock, the continuance of the public hearing pursuant to Selectmen's regulations and policies, Chapter 8, earth removal on Spectacle Pond Road. Item number 10, 8:15, around there, discuss proposal to change Board of Selectmen to a select board. 11, host agreements, negotiations, 3 of them updates on G7, Littleton Apothecary and Community Care Collective. Around 8:45, community compact, discussion of grant submission proposals. 9 o'clock, under the town administrator, support letters for Beaverbrook Great Road intersection, followed by Church Meadows contract, and acceptance of a gift from Middlesex Savings Charitable Foundation, and going over minutes. So that's the agenda. Cindy, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Certainly. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Usually we have more people in the room to.
I know. Maybe they're all over at the planning board.
Maybe we're just not, maybe we're not popular. Reading of mail. Town Administrator, Nina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We received a letter from Xfinity and their TV updates. We received a letter from Mr. and Mrs. Grogan at 48 Grimes Lane regarding potential contamination, or their concern for potential contamination of their well from stormwater runoff due to the proximity of a detention basin. Also included in the packet is the response letter from our Board of Health, and also the response letter from our office, as the letter was written to me.
Just to be clear, I mean, since that's really in the bailiwick of the planning board, they're in the loop somewhere, I hope?
I believe that they received, let me just see, they.
Looked like they were CC'd on your letter, anyway.
Yes, yep.
So they would have,
Yep.
Jim Griffey answered, so he must have given something to the Board of Health too.
Yeah, so I'm not worried about the Board of Health, because I saw Gareffi's letter, just since this was, subject or a product of the planning board approved plan, I would have thought they should have been involved.
Thank you for raising that. From Verizon, their annual complaint filing, in other words, a document that they're required to file with us as to the number of complaints that they've received over the past year. Central Mass Mosquito Control letter with their proposed budget for the pursuant following year. The Mass Municipal Association's legislative breakfast, one of which is going to be held on Friday, February 28th, in the fire department for town officials across the area. And then finally, a letter from the state regarding the certification of our new building commissioner, Ed Mullen.
On the mosquito control project, that letter that came out, and to make the community aware, a lot of people don't even know we have this. When the season comes up, you're allowed to email them on a form. Go to their website, go to their form, and you can have, they'll come down your driveway. The one thing at your convenience, Nina, if possible, if you can contact them and find out what their policy is, because at one time they would go completely onto your property and spray in certain areas that you knew were bad, and all of a sudden they were only going down parts of a driveway, and the driver I had said, we're only allowed to do part of a driveway and would leave. So it's changed. One time they do whatever you needed, and now, I think it was last year, at the beginning of the year, they could just come in part way down and take it off. So
Another, just from personal experience, item regarding the mosquito spraying the public ought to be aware of is you have to call fairly early in the season. I tried, I think it was early August. Oh, you just missed our deadline. It's like, from their calculation, they're not breeding anymore. Well, they're around for a couple more months thereafter.
That's true.
And so if you think you're gonna do it, you should do it, early in the year, or, at least research it.
And I think it's once every 2 weeks they'll come, and you can actually request you have to go online and make the request itself.
Right.
Okay, so just to summarize, we're looking for a clarification on what their policy is in terms of spraying
Yes,
on
that's it,
specific
yeah.
lots. Okay, very good.
Okay. Item number 3 is department board updates.
None at this point.
I have a blind right along.
Yep.
Item number 4, public input.
Anyone?
Okay.
Board members? He's not here tonight, but he usually is. I noticed on Facebook today that today is our active citizen par excellence, George Sanders' 75th birthday. So, George, if you're out there in TV world, happy birthday, and come back and join us next time.
I think our state senator and state rep are gonna give him some.
Yeah, that's where I noticed that Jim Arcero was handing him a proclamation. So.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure he used the time to give them an earful on something.
I do. So the Littleton Agricultural Commission is hosting a conversation about Littleton farms and their future. And it's gonna be a 3-part series. The first part is being hosted this coming March 18th between 6:30 and 9 o'clock at the library. So the Agricultural Commission is hoping that people will come out to the library and listen to the first part of this series, which sounds really interesting to me. This is a new initiative by the Agricultural Commission to raise awareness within the community about the farming community, the farms in our community. So March 18th at 6:30, it starts at the library.
Mr. Glavy?
Yep.
Mr. Gerbeck, anything?
I don't think so, no.
You did miss public input.
Hopefully everyone's at the form-based code.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm
presentations
hoping.
I know your roots are in Colorado, so you're probably not that familiar with the bean pot, but that's tonight.
No, my cousin's playing tonight.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my cousin plays for our BU. He's a graduate student.
Oh, wow.
What's his name?
Alex Brink. He
Oh,
transferred from
sure.
Brown.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm
He's
a
a-
long-time
he's
BU
one
season
to go
ticket
in the
holder.
bean pot.
That's great.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. All right, so we want to get out of here.
Okay. Next one, do we need Mr. Montanari here?
We do not. No, the Affordable Housing Trust Board, he's actually at the form-based code
Right.
presentation at the fire station tonight. He had a
He's
conflict.
not blowing us off. They have their own meeting.
Yeah,
Right.
so Mark's been participating in the Affordable Housing Trust process for over a year now. This is just really a formality to get him officially appointed to that board.
So I guess all we need is a motion then.
Sure.
Move that the Board of Selectmen vote pursuant to Section 813 of the Littleton General Bylaws to appoint Mark Montanari to fill a vacancy on the Affordable Housing Trust.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? 6. Boards and committees, the 2021 budget discussions.
So, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, we have in our packet a copy of the basically final discussions and further, based on further investigation, any additional changes or modifications to the discussion that the board and the finance committee had on Saturday, February 1st. As you can see in the packet, we have basically all of the capital items that were discussed to be funded for fiscal '21, and any specific notations such as, partial funding for the ambulance. For the case of the Elder and Human Services van, there was a request that it go before the Friends. The Friends have seen that request to partially fund the 1/3 of the van, and they have since funded it, so many thanks to the Friends for their support in that item. And then at the very bottom of the list, just to point out the kind of items that are slightly different than others, the addition to the capital stabilization for the library debt at $1 million to offset, to try to support the costs in terms of interest costs and reductions of interest costs relating to that project.
If I might interrupt on that point, I don't object to it, but it seems like that number is slightly different than it was when we left that room. Or
Sure.
are you able to highlight which numbers are different than what we had, how we had left it?
So if you recall, we had first had a conversation about the Fay Park, and the idea was to bring that discussion forward. That request was $300,000, so there's a $100,000 delta there that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head, where we transferred the idea to fund that initiative and ask that department to come forward with more discussions in the summer time,
Plan.
so that we can plan out a little bit
Well,
further.
no, that I recall, but I mean, when we left, after Cheryl had made the changes that we had, that was included amongst them, but it was, the bottom line number that allowed for the offset to the library just seemed to be a smaller
It
number.
was, at one point, it was 800,
Right.
initially it was $860,000.
That's the number I recall.
That delta of $100,000 was towards the goal. Now, the board could make a different approach. If you don't, 1 million isn't necessarily the number it has to be. It can be changed today, but the discussion was the goal of $1 million.
Yeah.
And where the changes shook out to allow for the $1 million, that's why we have $1 million here.
Right, because we took, the big things were, we had 860, we moved the Fay Park off, so that then gave us almost 1.2 million.
Okay, your memory is probably more accurate than mine. So in my mind, I remember that we'd already cut the Fay Park off the list for now, but you're saying that was a,
The 860 was based on the 300 for Fay Park being part of the
Being part of
capital.
it,
So
okay.
then we took that off, then we added about 200 back on. I'm actually surprised we ended up on $1 million on the nose, but we added about 200 back on to the
Right.
capital. So there was some ambiguity at the end of the day of exactly what that number was, but.
Because we hadn't done the full calculations and cross-checked it.
Okay.
But I mean, and really, we're not necessarily $1 million on the nose. There's 2.4 available, and as you can see, the total here is really 2.3, so it's $1.1 million theoretically on the nose.
right,
But,
unless we choose to,
correct.
place it
That
somewhere
number,
else. Yeah.
the $1 million could be 900, it could be 1.1.
Yeah.
It could be 1 million, it's up to the
Yeah,
board.
and again, I don't quibble on that target, it raised a question in my mind that something must have changed. And so it maybe is if it's just a recalculation, or if it's simple as the Fay Park, then even if it was the Fay Park, there still should be an available amount above and beyond $1 million, would you say?
Well, because the ambulance wasn't incorporated in, at that stage until, so that's the delta of $100,000 only in between both of them.
Because the ambulance was, we were putting money toward it, half the
Yeah, correct.
estimated cost.
Correct.
Okay. And that was all right, and that was at a point when when it was $860,000 was the operating number for the library stabilization, or the?
Yes.
Okay. All right, as long as something didn't get changed in a follow-up conversation or
No, I don't think anything
internally.
materially changed. We did have that truck,
Okay.
that was the highway truck. that
Yeah,
was
we added
as
that
part of
back in,
discussion,
right, yeah.
But I don't think anything else materially
There
changed.
was one cruiser, not two,
One
right?
cruiser, correct?
Yeah.
I just lined this up against the numbers that Cheryl sent out in the revised capital recommendations.
That day.
Slide, yeah, that she sent out at 3:40 that afternoon.
Yep,
And all of the line items are there in the approximate dollar values, like the van is,
$186
Yeah.
greater.
yeah, okay, cool. I guess that's the surety I was looking for, that there wasn't like a follow-up conversation that
Okay.
not everybody had a.
no, looks like it lines up line for
And the van is supposed to, the 21,000 technically isn't obviously an impact here, but 186, that extra 186 will be funded elsewhere. The only other thing I want to mention on this list that is somewhat new information that we're looking at today is I anticipate the police parking lot sealer to actually be 15,000 in consultation with the finance director and the police chief. So
Okay.
that's actually a savings theoretically of $5,000.
Now, that slide then doesn't have the additional information, the wastewater general fund,
No, that would be the last.
park subsidy, and the BOS stipends in it, right?
That's the last slide.
Gotcha. See, get too
So
excited.
the next slide from here is just a sense of how the calculation occurs. I can't imagine the board's gonna wanna go through that right now. So if we flip to the last slide, unless you prefer to go through the details.
I'm not opposed to going through the details, but I think I'm all set with it. You know, I'm okay with things as they, as presented.
And then I would just say, let's touch on the last slide for a moment. Sorry, I don't have it up here. I probably should have done that. It's in your packet though.
Yeah,
For the last slide, the first bulleted item is the concept with the town planning department request, continue to utilize as recommended, the assistant town administrator to evaluate that department. For the cemetery seasonal, we did have a conversation with the cemetery superintendent, and he feels he can make the $6,000 work for
Oh, good.
the funding source for the summer, and was very appreciative of that. The fire prevention officer, we did have discussions with the fire chief and the deputy fire chief regarding holding off and reviewing over the next year possibilities and having further discussions about that subject. I did have a conversation with the library director, and they were much appreciative of the increase for the assistant director as proposed without the other modifications and additions.
Can I ask a very subtle question here? When we go through and we approve that, and we say, we're gonna add X number of dollars for the assistant director. Are we really adding X number of dollars for the assistant director, or is that at the discretion of Sam to figure out how he wants to spend that? In other words, does it have to be on the assistant director?
Technically.
And that's a relevant question for
Technically,
lots of these things.
I think your question stems at town meeting. And the way we vote things at town meeting is the bottom line of a department's budget. So in theory, if there is a vacancy, let's say, hypothetically in any position in the library, then the department head has the ability to look at their operations and say, I need to move things around in this fashion to make sure that we have the coverage we need to have. And the same goes for any department. And it allows the department head the discretion and flexibility to maintain their department in the right way. So technically, the bottom line is the addition goes towards a bottom line. But I think that the unwritten expectation is that every department will follow through, and if they don't follow through, that there's some level of communication back to this board
Okay.
and the finance committee as well. So maybe I shouldn't say the finance committee, because at that point, I don't know as though finance committee is engulfed in operations. There should be communication at a minimum with me, which I should be transferring to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
That answers it exactly. That the expectation is that if they're gonna shift things
Yeah.
around.
we had historically voted a line item budget, but if we move to just voting bottom lines for department, I think the conversation was always that at least in the municipal side of the house, they would still be honoring the presentations made.
Yeah, I think that's an expectation.
Schools, on the other hand, by law, have a different,
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
here's
here's your money.
here's a pot.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I do think that departments should communicate back with us. In many ways, they are doing that when they go to see our HR office, and our HR office then might be looping us in, but, yeah, that is a reasonable expectation.
Thank you.
Sure. The next item is one that we need to discuss and determine, which is the wastewater general fund appropriation. Does the board wish to continue with the straight costs from the prior year, or does the board want to increase it by the $22,000 proposed by the water commissioners at the last meeting? Do you want to stop and discuss that, or should I just keep going until we get to the bottom and then we can talk about the discussion points?
I think we should do them one by one, but
Yeah, so do I.
So for that one in particular, does the board wish to put it in at the requested $135,000 or maintain the $113,000 level funded from the prior year? I think the bottom line becomes, if we maintain the number from the prior year, we're committed to manage or deal with any capital requests. If we look at the other number, I think in some senses, we're still committed to dealing with the capital if the capital is larger than the difference of $22,000. So I don't know if there's a material difference in the process, but that's up to the board.
my sense is that, given the age of that system, it makes sense to to put some money aside there. Listen, I mean, if we end up spending none of that additional $22,000, it's not like it evaporates into the ether. It's now sitting there in a sewer fund. So I think it's good planning, recognizing the age of the system and recognizing that we may ask that system to go a year longer than its design life
Right.
to gap us into the full common sewer. So putting $20,000 in there, that's a pump.
I don't have a problem with that either.
I don't have a problem with it.
All right, next one is the Park and Rec, Community Education General Fund. There's one change here, and it's the offset for an aspect that was moved from the capital budget to the operating budget. So there's actually a request at this point to consider an additional $15,000 to the subsidy, making it a 78.4% self-funded entity. And this is a recommendation from both the finance director and myself, if the board is comfortable with that.
In the justification, the logic is it's offsetting costs that are being shifted into
A
the
different
operating.
pot.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
It's a mechanical issue rather
Yeah.
than anything else.
Yeah. I don't have a problem with that either.
That's fine.
The next one for the collector, the board and finance committee had requested that there be discussions with the collector and consider whether two part-time clerks would be most appropriate. And based on a number of different discussions, I think Cheryl had a couple different meetings on that. The recommendation remains to move the admin clerk from 19 hours to 30 hours.
And that had been what the consensus we left
The
it at?
group, I think, felt that either scenario was fine, but let's discuss whether there was a
Right.
possibility to go with two part-time positions.
And the impact,
And part of that was trying to understand if the current, how that impacts a current assistant. Do we go over what someone
Right.
wants in terms of hours, or?
yeah, or drive somebody out if they're, which we don't want to have happen, right? yeah.
Right.
But it looks like the assumption was in the budget for the 30 hours, so there's not a financial impact here, correct?
That's
Okay.
exactly right. The school appropriation, I understand that Gary Wilson and Chuck actually met with Mike Fontanella to discuss that item. And I will say, though, late today, I saw some emails coming through from our finance director in response to the chair of our school committee expressing some concerns with regard to having the opportunity to have the school committee review that information before it's finalized. So I don't know if the board wishes to hold on that and take that up at another time, or if the board wishes to continue and move
Is there a
forward.
reason we don't get forwarded those emails? I mean, it's germane to the budget process.
I know that Joe was copied as chair of the board, but it was late this afternoon, and by no means am I suggesting that Joe should have forwarded it, but I think we're talking about 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon where we saw that.
I didn't even see it yet.
All right, but just as a general rule, if we're getting communications back and forth on a budget, especially since we're making recommendations on the budget, I'd like to see them.
Yeah, me too.
Yep, fair enough. I should have forwarded that. The difficulty I had was assembling everything today in preparation for this meeting.
Yep.
The item that's not on here is one that we had discussed at the meeting on Saturday, which I hadn't had an opportunity to meet with the school superintendent on until this afternoon. And it was the idea of potentially consolidating or assisting the school department with their HR part-time request. The school superintendent and I had the discussion today, and in general, I think there are some nuances that we're working out with the facilities manager position, which we can see coming up and having to be worked out with other collaborations. That coupled with the fact that we believe, I believe I can say for him, that we believe we need those resources in our departments. We don't believe that right now is the time, but he and I both agreed that we would be glad to continue the discussion on that to see if in future years we can assist by not having further FTE requests as the town continues to grow, or trying to look at potential ways to consolidate and provide efficiencies as we bring on staff. So that item is unchanged from before, but we did have the conversation. And then the new ones that hadn't come up previously is the Crosstown Connect fee is gonna be likely increasing by about $6,000. I have a meeting later on this week, but I expect that we're gonna be requesting that the EHS budget increase by that amount. And the reason is because the share of costs isn't proportional to the other two communities. One of the communities is bearing a significant amount of the burden. And in looking at it from the perspective of percentage use of the system, our share shows a higher number essentially. And then the last one is a slight modification to the increase for the final regional school assessment based on information that we received. The final budget hasn't been voted by the technical school committee yet, but it is anticipated to be 6,400 greater.
Okay.
That's an assessment, we can't do much about it anyway, right?
There was a as I believe the board knows, based on prior correspondence, there was a increase in the number of students for the town, and that's largely driving the cost. But they have had and acknowledged that they have an increase for the following year that's been greater than prior years because they're no longer subsidizing with available funds, and they're trying to make sure that what they're doing is sustainable also.
They have some great programming over there. Did some of you folks get a chance to go? I unfortunately had a doctor appointment scheduled that morning.
Chuck, Cheryl, Joe Layden, and I were present, as well as Gary Wilson, Alan, McCray, and I believe, hope I'm not missing anyone. I believe that's it. And of course, our school committee, we had the opportunity to sit with Charlie Ellis and have a meal with him, which was very nice.
Yeah. Is he chair over there now on their board?
He is.
He is, yeah.
2 years in a row.
Oh, yeah.
It's an incredible school. My son graduated there 2014.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he did,
Yeah,
electrical. Yeah, it's great opportunity for, great alternative for
They
students.
got amazing equipment in there. I mean, well, we were there when the governor came out a couple of
Right,
years ago.
yeah,
That was,
no, I think every student
technology
from,
stuff there.
right, that goes through Littleton Public Schools should at least take a look at that school.
Yeah.
Just gonna check the mics back there.
And here comes Kirby.
We have,
Thank you, thank you.
we had an empty seat up here, Kirby, if you want to.
You won't be up there.
Oh, why not?
So depending upon which items the board is comfortable moving forward, or which items the board wishes to hold, we could vote. I mean, the idea here would be that it would be helpful to vote these so that we can begin assembling the budget and begin assembling the warrant. If there are items we need to hold out, probably, as maybe Gary Wilson said recently, if we can get 90-something% of it done, that's great. So I don't know if there are items that the board wishes to hold out and then vote the remainder, or if the board has another alternative it wishes to explore.
Now, is this the opportunity to talk about stipends for the?
Yes, that would be the next, actually, that can go hand in hand or can be next, however you, we didn't touch on that one, and that's the only one remaining on the list of things that we have to address. So I'll just dive right into that, Mr. Chairman. if-
Yes, please.
We, as a result of the hearing board feedback throughout the course of my time here, and understanding that obviously the board puts in a considerable amount of time into their work, I did put a placeholder for the board's discussion for the FY '21 budget for a total stipend amount of $5,000. And the board has wanted to discuss that, and what more appropriate time than now to discuss that and decide what the number should be.
I just know that the first time I was on the board back in the 1980s, we had a stipend back then. And
Yeah.
I think it was right afterwards, for some reason, they eliminated it, and it's been eliminated since.
I remember some of the painful details a little bit more. I think when the board was a 3-member board, it was $1,000, and then when the board expanded to 5, they kept the number at 1,000, so your pay went down.
I was part of that.
Yeah, hey, that's right. You were on the first 5-member board, right? Yeah, and you're actually a holdover from the 3-member board era. Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
Last week, yeah.
no kidding.
Yeah, but and then later on, in whatever budget crisis of the moment, somebody had the great idea to exit out entirely, and I don't know. I mean, I know Chuck has taken the lead in making this putting this before us, but since he's not here, I don't mind taking up the cause. This is more for future generations than us. I don't expect to be around to collect many of these checks, but if we're going to do it, then I think we ought to do it consistent with what is pretty common in other towns around the area. And I think that number is about half a starting point. If you're going to do it at all, it probably ought to be at least about $2,000 a year just to be a meaningful stipend. I don't know whether we need to go out and do a full-blown study of what all the area towns do, but I think we should, operate on a number bigger than that. I think whatever blowback or argument we're going to get is going to be irrelevant to the dollar figure. It's going to be more on principle, and I think either they're going to support the concept or not. And if you're going to do it right. Nobody's going to get rich on that.
Right. Well, I know that we did, I think informally look at surrounding towns and, they range from 800 to 3,500 depending on the community. So, I agree with, Paul's assessment, around 2,000 I think would be a good,
Yeah.
per board member. I mean, and there's certainly ways that we could quantify that and dive into it deeper if the board wishes to, but I just, to your point, we're gonna get pushback whether, we could anticipate pushback whether it's $1,000 or collectively or 2,000 per member, so.
Yeah, I think that 2,000 per member number seems reasonable to me. The only thing that I would mention is that I think some communities give the chair a slightly higher stipend in recognition of their additional workload.
That's true.
I don't know if we want to bite that off as well, but it's
I'm not
not an
opposed to that.
atypical thing to do.
Yeah, that's true too.
I just know that through time, things have changed an awful lot, and the load on the Board of Selectmen is a lot more than it ever was before, the amount of time. I knew when we were doing interviews in the fall, I think I totaled it up in 1 week, I had 27 extra hours.
Right,
So that's like having an extra job, so.
yeah,
uh,
it's true.
Yeah, it ends up costing you. A lot of us, if you're self-employed, you lose it out of your own income. If you're working for somebody else, you're taking time off, you shouldn't,
Right,
you shouldn't have to.
Right.
And,
You lost
true.
vacation time,
I
huh?
did, I lost a whole week last year. I mean, it adds up,
Yeah, so
so,
I would say 2,000, leave it at that, we can.
How about Chase's idea? Hate to make the chair's job so competitive, never threw a financial interest in other makes, but I mean, there is truth to it. The chair does have more,
2,000 and 2,500 for the chair makes, I think, good and defensible sense.
I can go with that.
yeah, that sounds fine.
All right.
And that would be like.
Sounds fine in an empty room, let's
Yeah,
say.
right, right, yeah. Come out and yell at us at the next meeting. Yeah. So that would be like 10-5 total?
10-5.
Of course, we discussed it, people are gonna say that's why it was done, there's no one in the audience.
I can't remember a meeting when nobody was
I
here.
know. I hope they're all at the fire station.
We have something, there he is.
Oh, thank you, Kirby.
I hope they scan the audience when they see who's back there.
I gotta go up and check and see how Conscom's doing.
So we
I
all
do,
set with this?
speaking of Conscom, do have to
Yeah,
decamp up
I mean,
there.
do you want to
Oh, you
vote,
do?
Nina?
I think
Okay.
it would be helpful to
Yeah.
memorialize some of these different things, so that also we can share that information with the finance committee tomorrow,
that's-
so that they can memorialize it as well. So I think it would be,
So the only thing we're not, my understanding is the only thing we're not carrying forward and voting on right now is the school budget piece. Is that right? The $75,000 number.
That's right.
That's the request that's on the table, yeah.
Okay.
I think that makes sense, and only because I really would prefer to see the school committee bless that before we
Okay,
Okay.
shove it down the throat.
so I guess,
Is that the form of the motion that you think is appropriate?
Yeah, and you can modify it in any way that you think it makes sense, so you could say, move, to approve with exception of, if
Okay.
you wish. And then I would say, including perhaps the
Stipend.
stipend.
Okay. Move that the Board of Selectmen vote to approve the fiscal year 2021 Board of Selectmen and FinCom capital plan recommendations and the fiscal year 21 operating budget recommendations, with the exception of stay with me for a second, with the exception of the reduced school appropriation of $75,000 and including a Board of Selectmen stipend of $2,000 for all of the members except for the chair, and a $2,500 annual stipend for the chair.
Second.
Motion's been made and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? So carried. Item 7, open warrant, set closing date, insert articles if possible. The May 4th, 2020 annual town meeting.
So, Mr. Chairman, as I believe the board has done in the past, the board's tradition is to open the warrant at about this time, and it's consistent with the timeline that was adopted by the board back in, I believe, December. So there's a motion ready to go for the opening of the warrant and the closing of when the closing of the warrant would occur on March 20th.
That's all we need right now, right?
And if I would, I would appreciate if the board has the interest to discuss some of the preliminary list of potential warrant articles so that,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'd like to go through those, but again, I'd prefer to hold off voting, including them, until we actually saw the language on any of them.
So you want to vote to open it, Joe?
Yes, please.
Motion, anyway. Move that the Board of Selectmen vote pursuant to MGL Chapter 39, Section 10, and Town Code Section 41-1 to open the warrants for the Monday, May 4th, 2020 annual town meetings forthwith, and to close said warrants on Friday, March 20th, 2020 at noon. Said town meeting to be held in the Charles Forbes K Gymnasium, Littleton Middle School, 55 Russell Street, Littleton.
Second.
Motion's been made and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed?
thanks for dropping the second plural there. I think with dropping the special town meeting, we have too many plurals on the word meetings. So, okay, before you is a copy of the town meeting timeline, final revision 1. In other words, it's the final document that you voted, but it's the first revision that you're seeing. For items 1 and 2, I think those are straightforward and standard, the town officers, the annual report. Item 3 is a pretty standard item, any bills from the prior year. That would be obviously for fiscal 19, if there are any at that point. And then the next item is the fiscal, of course, these are all supposed to say 2021, some of them say 2020, so that will be
Right.
changed. The 2021 operating budget, line item transfers, appropriations into blended CPA, if we have those. Capital plan amendments. Go ahead.
Would that one be that would be a FY 2020, right? Some of
Oh,
them,
I'm sorry, these are all FY '20, I'm not sure why I jumped ahead, these are all intended to be FY '20.
right, because those are, and then you get to your 2021 items the next year. This is
Yep.
cleaning
bill-
up the
bills-
existing year before it ends.
Yeah, the bills of the prior year should still be a 19, if there are any from, at that point,
Right.
but, yeah, that's a good catch.
So it's accurate as written.
It is accurate as written, with exception of the lack of notation on the prior one.
Yeah.
But that's even general too, because it could be a
Could
fiscal
be earlier than
18
that.
vote.
Exactly, right,
Exactly.
right. I'll just leave it as is. We were lonely. We needed company, Marge.
Pardon me, I do. You're all here. Gee, I know. How come? I was interested in one of your agenda items,
Yeah.
so.
The next one is to close out the alumni field and fire station special appropriations. We have some additional funding in those and just standard to rescind them. Then the next is to reappropriate, this one is that when we voted the library design funds, it was only for design, and they're finding that they may not need all 1.5 for design and could use, some of that surplus for construction. So this would be to request that, and in the future, we'll try to drop our articles to be a little bit more broad, so that we don't encounter this issue again, but as you can imagine, at the stage that they were in, they were asking for design funds, and they were asking for those so that they could present a request for construction funds. It would have been, unless it was worded very specifically as to say hypothetically, the design funds, 1.5 for design funds, and if a future construction amount is voted, then for construction.
Any excess
Yeah,
funds
right.
could be.
And we're gonna try to wordsmith items in the future so we can handle those so that they don't have to be done at a town meeting again, assuming the board is comfortable.
I mean, my advice on that would be not to try and get too cute with those sometimes though, because I can see us backing ourselves into a rhetorical corner at town meeting because it's got some weird clause in it, and we spend half an hour debating a clause that we thought we were trying to make it easier. This is something that will go, it will just sail through. Obviously, we would use any excess funds, right? So,
Yeah, and perhaps, you know, if we identify language in a future scenario that we think could be helpful, we could present it, and if the board thinks, forget it, let's just keep it simple. We could, and not to say that you have to do it one way or another, but let's maybe take a shot at writing it to see what happens.
yeah, I agree. I think that's fine. It would be nice if we didn't have to, but
Right.
I'm also not too worried about the fact that we're gonna have this vote that shifts money we've already appropriated.
Sure. Standard FY 2021 revolving funds. We need to authorize a COA revolving fund, which I understand we have and utilize. Item number 11, the 2021 operating budget, 2021 water enterprise operating budget, 2021 PRCE enterprise operating budget. Those are three pretty standard ones. Capital items from available funds, and this is where we might insert some of the language relating to the ambulance, but one thing we didn't necessarily talk about is potentially having a vehicle stabilization fund. We may put the $200,000 for the ambulance into a vehicle stabilization fund, or it may be proposed a different way. We're kind of discussing different mechanical options so that funding is separated out for when we have the additional $200,000 to supplement for the ambulance replacement. And then the 2021 community preservation budget, any personnel bylaw amendments that are anticipated, at least one that I can think of off the top of my head, and the personnel board needs to discuss these things further, is the fact that our step and grade system may need to be approved a different way. Otherwise, we're stuck mid-year. That's something we discovered this last go-around. And a good example of that would be if we wanted to, mid-year, bring on a facilities manager. We're not sure we could do that without town meeting approval. Now, coincidentally, you'll see further down on number 26, we actually can't do that because we have to adopt a separate general law. But if we didn't have to adopt that general law, we wouldn't want this to be a hindrance of general operations. So we have to figure out the mechanics of how those things go through the process. And that may be further discussion between the board and personnel board.
Oh, never mind, we're gonna come to it. Carry on.
Stabilization fund, capital stabilization fund, debt exclusion stabilization fund. The next one, trust fund grant. This is the one that I believe our treasurer, Steve Venuti, had proposed with regard to utilizing the surplus on insurance proceeds, I believe. Nope, that was on the prior page. Trust fund grant, maybe it's something that historically has occurred. I'm just trying to. Yeah, this looks like an item that has historically come up, so I probably need to look into what that is more specifically. The next item, senior citizens and veterans tax work-off. I'm sure that goes without say and is pretty straightforward. Use of Mass DOT Chapter 90 funds. One thing on this one that I'd like to see if the board would be interested to change is historically we've identified the amount that we're gonna get, and then if we've received surplus amounts, we've had to go back to town meeting. Would the board be willing to go with a more general article that doesn't specify an amount, and it would just say that we'll accept the funds and we'll take any funds we get, rather than having to go back a second time if we got additional funds?
But how do they get appropriated?
The way that the law is written is it does not require further appropriation. It requires acceptance, but it does not require further appropriation, unless we specify the number. The number hamstrings us, basically. And the bill itself specifically says without further appropriation.
When we budget, how do we, remind me how we incorporate the Chapter 90 funds in the budget? Is it an estimate or what? And I'm just leery of, I hear this logic to that, but if it makes the underlying budget numbers meaningless, you know, because they can change depending upon what we get.
It doesn't really get inserted, it doesn't get inserted in the operating budget. It's
Okay.
a special article, it's a special account specifically dedicated to chapter 90, so it doesn't really affect.
So whatever
Bottom line.
happens there will affect the level of activity, but it is not reflected in the appropriated budget. If that's the case, then I don't have a problem with that.
I mean, I'm definitely speaking as to accounting practices in other
Right.
communities, because I haven't looked at this one specifically, but I imagine that would be the same. The next three, I think, certainly would need some more information on them and developing as we go along. It's the form-based code, where there's a hearing tonight, we're gonna need some additional information on that. Smart sewer project, it's obviously in the works, being analyzed, and
Could be two articles there, right?
Could be
A land
multiple,
article,
yeah.
yeah, right, I
Yeah.
mean, we don't know, land article and a funding article in general, and who knows what else. right?
Correct.
Yeah.
and then.
I don't know if we need a land article. I think we might be good to go on that.
The vote last fall covered that, kind of like,
It would just be part of the whole sewer project.
okay, well,
Yeah, I think you could do it a couple different ways. We did say that we would come back before taking
Right.
action, so I think it
Yeah.
could be bundled,
right. it
but
could-
yeah.
But no matter.
As long as it's
those-
addressed
Those are
before the town,
subtleties
right,
that we're
right,
gonna
yeah.
have to figure out.
And then purchase of Tehadawon land, should we end up finding ourselves going in that direction, subject to the appraisal that have in motion right now? 26, the item I just mentioned a moment ago, in order to share a position between school and town, there's a general law statute that we need to accept at town meeting.
Can we digress on that for just one
Sure.
second? Where does that position stand in terms of
Process.
making it happen?
Sure. So, going back to, oh boy, what month was it? I don't know, October perhaps, the board said that they would be comfortable with me bringing the item forward, just as the historical recap, to the school department to see if they wanted to incorporate the school committee into the conversation, or if they would like for the school superintendent and myself to take it on. In speaking with the school superintendent, he did ask the chair of the school committee to participate in discussions, so in turn, I asked the chair of the Board of Selectmen to participate in discussions. We had an initial meeting back in November, I believe, and the agreement at the time between the group was that the school superintendent and I would work out the draft
Sort of
job
sharing.
description,
Okay.
so that we could figure out, what items we had to work out, and then bring it back to that group. At this point, we have a solid draft. We actually met the school superintendent and I today to discuss that draft. And I want to make sure that it gets circulated amongst that group, because that also included the chair of the PMBC, which is a critical component of this. What's unique, I think, about Littleton and this specific structure is that under our general bylaws, the PMBC, as you all know, is responsible for all capital projects, basically. This manager would essentially be assisting the PMBC with capital projects and be fully responsible for maintenance projects, as opposed to being responsible for both fully.
Excuse me.
So some of that needed to be finessed, and obviously the sharing concepts needed to be finessed. We were discussing broadly the concept of how we would set up interviews, and I was suggesting, and historically, we've had interview teams of no greater than 6. So, if the school superintendent and I were participating on that, then each of us would have an additional 2 spots, and honestly, that's a topic of conversation if the board wishes to have it tonight, since it came up organically. Depending upon, does the board wish to have a representative at the table for those meetings? In speaking with the school superintendent, he wasn't sure if we had a elected official at the table, if they would then feel that they had to have an elected official at the table. So I don't know if you want to have further discussion on that on a different night, or if we would like to kind of discuss that further tonight in terms of moving that along. But I anticipate, because of the timing as it relates to the acceptance of the general law that we're specifically talking about right now, we are likely going to be in a situation that the goal would be to have an advertisement and screening process all occur before town meeting, so that the day after town meeting, when town meeting has given us the authority to make a shared position, we can extend an offer letter. Again, this is the goal.
We don't need the AG to bless that.
It's not a it's not a bylaw change,
Okay.
so no. It's just an acceptance of a state
Sure.
statute, so.
Okay. So we would be looking to bring someone on in our current fiscal year.
That would be the goal. As
Okay.
far as I would recommend it.
Sure.
You know, I think that's certainly subject to further discussion by the board if the board has a different opinion. But I would recommend we bring someone on as quickly as possible with, obviously without compromising the process.
I don't have any problem with that. I do think there should be a board member involved, especially since it's a new position, especially since it's a joint venture with the schools. There's a lot of high wire stuff there that,
I think that makes good sense, but I also like, and I like the idea that the schools would essentially be mirroring us, you know, ideally, right, you know?
Yeah.
We
May
have,
or may not. I mean,
yeah, well,
they're-
that's their
their
call.
appointment
their
process
call,
is
but
different.
I would expect they would at that point, but, right, to have Nina and Kelly, to have a member of each board, and then frankly, whoever else they decide to
Right.
pull on, whether that's someone from the community or PMBC or whatever.
Somebody from
you know.
PNBC. Yeah.
A flex position for
Yeah.
each of those to a point. That sounds like a good structure.
So how far along are you with that, with Kelly?
Could you just pass this down after reading it? We are almost finalizing the job description at this point.
I know who that was.
Thank you, Kirby.
So when do you expect to have the job description finalized, and what does finalizing the job description mean? Who ultimately
For our
signs off?
side, I think it needs to come before the Board of Selectmen to review.
Okay.
For the school side, the school superintendent is probably the stop because he doesn't have the same structure. He has a lot more latitude to hire anyone in his organization.
Okay,
So I can't speak to their side, but I can say, I think from my perspective on the town side, it probably should come to the board unless for some reason the board doesn't wish to see it. Maybe the board feels like the one member who's selected should, that's for discussion by you all.
sure.
So perhaps on a coming agenda, we could put that item and discuss the draft and move that forward.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Great.
I'm just glad to hear, so much was happening in the background and I didn't know much about it.
Same, yeah.
Glad to hear that there's a job description and we're well on track to do it.
Sure. The second to last item is the bylaw change that I think I had mentioned to the board some time ago, changing the chief procurement officer from our finance director to our town administrator, and then I would ultimately plan to delegate it probably to the assistant town administrator. And then include a change under the PMBC for signing contracts because of the way that the PMBC bylaw is written. Of course, as with anything, if you make one change here, you may have to make multiple changes here or there. That's the one I've noticed, there may be others. And then lastly, same that we've discussed the COA revolving fund, just in addition to the bylaws to recognize the COA revolving fund, which is required.
I think there is one you're potentially missing from your list. I've heard rumblings that Durkee Estates would be looking to have their roads accepted. Perhaps that's,
I-
you know the status of
yeah.
that? If you don't know the status of it, you might want to touch base with Marion to see
Sure.
where it's at.
I can ask again, the last time we had a discussion on whether or not any roads were gonna be ready for finalization, which was 2 weeks ago, the answer was no.
Oh, okay.
But something may have changed.
Your information may well be, not may well, is probably better and fresher than mine.
Okay, thank you for your time on that.
So we're all set, number 7?
I think so, yeah.
Is there any need to add any of these right now? I mean,
It's up to the board, and Paul expressed the interest to see the language before they're added.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see that as well.
I don't think it matters either way. For a lot of these, right?
You can
That
finalize
doesn't
the
matter
language.
until you see language that doesn't reflect what you thought it was gonna say.
Right.
Sorry, for some of these, like the town officers. but
Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next item, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'm gonna switch presentations so I can bring up the presentation on the screen for the municipal's building space needs.
Item number 8.
Joe, at 7:30, I gotta pop upstairs to conservation and chat with them for a few minutes about Tehadawon.
Okay.
Talking to her regarding the Tehadawon property. Shouldn't take too long, 15 minutes.
Sounds good to me.
So I would defer to Cindy if.
Sure, great. Thanks, Nina. So LLB had done a presentation to the board on the 27th, presenting various scenarios as a result of the space needs study that's been ongoing for quite a while now. Chuck, myself, and Nina have been working closely with them over the past few months. So based on some feedback we received after that presentation, we went back to LLB and asked them to revise some areas in the presentation. How
It's
do
the
I?
next arrow, because it's not actually on the screen, but it will change up there.
Ah, perfect. So as you can see, what we did was we changed some of the colors that they were
Good
using.
choice.
That they were utilizing to identify each department, just to make it more prominent and easier to read. So none of the content has changed, as you can see, but I think it's just a little bit more clear for people at home and anyone looking at the presentation in itself. And so this is just a program analysis which identifies the existing, the proposed, and the future growth for each of the main departments, the town administration, finance, building department, school department, park and recreation, which does include an area where they had requested space for a gymnasium, Elder and Human Services, LCTV, and support staff. So this is, again, the new program diagram, which illustrates how much space, existing space, and how much space is anticipated for each one of those departments. It just gives you a different visual to really be able to grasp and see how much space may be required based on the information that they gathered from each one of the departments.
Now, when they talk to the departments, did they actually, is it wants or is it needs? I mean, do we,
Well, I'm going to use the Council on Aging as an example. Their space requirements are mandated by the National Association of Councils on Aging. They actually have a formula that they utilize. And then it's so much square foot per senior is recommended by that agency. And then on top of that, it goes to talk about what needs programming they would like to see within that fingerprint, that blueprint, so to speak. With respect to the Parks and Rec, I think it was based on users and.
Utilization, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I would add that in all of the meetings that the architect had with the staff and town departments, we did begin the conversation with, please identify what your needs are and also what your wants are. We're not going to be able to make all the wants work.
Right.
But we want to understand what your needs are, and we may not even be able to make all of those work too, because we have constraints. But I think departments were very receptive of that conversation, and the architect was also instrumental in having those discussions and trying to
And
separate
drawing
out
that
what was.
information
Yep,
out.
That's
yeah.
right.
It is, I think, an interesting conversation that we have to continue to have with respect to COA and Parks and Rec, which is that their success breeds needs.
More needs, yeah.
Right. And those are unambiguously good things.
Right.
Right. If they were less successful, they would have fewer needs.
Right.
How we balance those is a challenge. Take, for example, Park and Recs. It's not a space needs example, and I'm deliberately choosing one that's not space related. I didn't hear a lot of people in the community clamoring for a sailing program, but then Parks and Rec put it out there, and it became very successful.
Right.
Which then bred the need to support that. And so that's a good thing, but particularly as we go forward in this, we've got to decide how much we want them to continue to
Right.
to grow that support.
Right.
I don't know what I'm throwing it out there like I have an answer or something. I have no
Right.
answers.
but
But
Right.
it's a tricky question.
it's an
Well-
interesting and very challenging thing for us to resolve.
Right. And I think that is true with respect to, the Park and Recreation Department. I think with the Council on Aging and this Elder and Human Services, it's a little bit different because it's based on the growth of the population growth. It's based on a specific demographic who are relying on that agency for services. They're coming to them. for their programming and the needs that they offer, rides, blood pressure clinics, all sorts of things like that. So I think it's a little bit of variation between the two departments, but I do understand what you said. Elder and Human Services is involved into this amazing program, and Liz has done a great job with that department. But I really think that the needs of that department are just a little bit different than the Park and Recreation Department. And again, this is just a slide showing, we looked at, this building, 37 Shattuck Street as well as 255 Great Road, and this is just a slide showing the different locations from an aerial perspective. This is the 255 Great Road building, which was one of the possibilities that the town was looking at for Elder and Human Services. The architects did a very comprehensive analysis of this building and determined for a variety of reasons that it wouldn't be a good fit for the town based on the existing conditions of the building, but also from a space needs point of view, it was actually too large of a building for the Elder and Human Services Council on Aging, and it wasn't big enough to support both the Elder and Human Services Council on Aging and the Park and Rec. So there was a variety of different variables that went into why it was their conclusion that this wouldn't be a good fit for the town to meet our needs.
And that, so one of the things that I understood them to say, but I want to make sure I didn't misunderstand them, is that they looked at the building itself, right? Not just
the programming.
Not just the programming
Yeah.
and things like that, right?
Yeah,
And they also, when they were talking, they seemed to put a lot of weight in the campus aspect, and I appreciate that. And
Yeah.
But the fact that 255 Great Road was not part of the campus
Right.
was only part of the consideration. Part of it was also just the physical structure.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. They really did a very comprehensive look at that building from a structural perspective, and they came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to work for the town,
Okay.
yeah.
So at this point, does that mean we have eliminated that?
We have, and honestly, Joe, so what we did with this process was we said, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at this building, we're looking at 255 Great Road. We had them meet with all the departments, had them piece everything together. But they also did, what was the term, Nina? The structural integrity?
What
did they call it?
The building envelope, nothing else.
The building envelope, yeah.
The quality of construction at the time in the 80s, and if you
Right.
recall, our new building commissioner, Ed Mullen, also commented on that.
Right.
That just, it's not as, well,
We'd have to put some
yeah.
substantial amount of money into that, so. Yeah, so it was their conclusion that that wasn't a good option for the town. And this is just a little bit more of their breakout. As you can see, the shortfall in the space is designated in the bars to the left there. If we did try to pursue that location. So now we're back to Shattuck Street, and considering the campus, this is the existing conditions of the current envelope of the Shattuck Street building. Normal wear and tear, what you would expect on a building of this age. But they actually were pretty impressed at the structural integrity of this building, considering its age. So they just pointed out some of the structural shortfalls that they identified. And this is just more of an overview of those areas that they found. This is the existing conditions at Shattuck Street, and I think this slide shows it as it is today. That's correct, Nina?
That would be correct, that would
Yeah,
be
so
the
this-
library not included, is
Right.
the only change technically.
Right, so this is the way this building's laid out as it is today, taking into consideration that the library's gonna vacate this building. And then we have the access diagram, which personally wasn't crazy about this diagram. I think it's hard to read, but it basically shows the different access points for this building, which it shows that it's a complicated building the way it's been designed. It was a school, but it's been added on to and broken up for different departments for a very different use other than a school. And then this is the existing efficiency diagram, as you can see, with the different hallways and access and egress points. It's really not an efficient building the way it's currently designed. And then this is the inefficiencies you can see that are noted in the existing floor spaces, and then the new, and this shows what we would need for new bathrooms, is that correct, Nina? With-
Just based on the flow of
Yeah,
people
the flow
as it
thing.
currently exists?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and also meeting the various ADA requirements as it
Right,
relates to.
exactly. Right, like the Elder and Human Services doesn't even have a handicapped accessible bathroom on the first floor, neither does Park and Rec.
Cindy, I'm sorry to do this.
Okay, so this is,
Are we back?
Shouldn't be too long.
this is scheme 1, which is Shattuck Street. And this is showing the library vacated and a gut renovation of the entire Shattuck Street building to meet all of the needs, the current needs of the departments that would remain in this building with the library vacated. And then this slide shows that the existing departments that are currently in this building would still not fit in this building in its current envelope. And you can see the shortfall of the space designated to the left in the bars. It's color-coded by department. So as you can see, even just a gut renovation of this building as a whole won't meet the needs of the departments that are currently in this building, even with the vacating of the library. So now we're on to scheme 2, and so this scheme shows that the library has vacated their building on the slope site, but it also shows the COA EHS located on what we call the north side of the campus here at Shattuck Street, and what that could look like if we did take the Department of COA EHS and located them onto the north side of the campus. And then what that reveals is that the existing departments that would remain in this building, and there is still a minor shortfall with respect to,
Administration,
Yeah.
building, I'm sorry, finance or building, is it? Finance, it looks like.
yeah,
And support spaces.
right. But it was the belief of the architects with this scheme that that shortfall could be, that gap could be filled.
Yeah.
Just by certain reconfigurations. We've talked about this, Nina, is going paperless and, utilizing that mechanism to free up some space in this building would definitely work. And then this is just scheme 2 again. It shows a more close-up diagram of what would be the COA and the EHS first and second floor space located on the north side of the campus. And this is just a diagram. There's no space identified within that footprint whatsoever.
And this may not even be, if this scheme is followed through towards the end hypothetically, depending upon further feedback and discussion, this may not even be the structure of the way
It might.
the foundation may not have this footprint.
It might
This
be-
is just a concept.
Right, exactly.
On paper.
Right. So the next scheme was scheme 3, and this is a gut renovation of Shattuck Street complex, and construct a new town hall without TV on the north side? What?
LCTV probably?
Oh, okay. So this was just another option. Oh, this is when they reverse it.
Yes.
So basically, they put the COA and EHS in Shattuck Street, and then they take all the town departments and then construct a building on the north site, which is another possibility to do as well. And that shows what this would look like for scheme 3, the footprint of that. So it'd be a 26,319 square foot building. Scheme 4 depicts a gut renovation of Shattuck Street, new town hall on the south side, so you can see that blue building. That would be an addition where the vacated library space is located, and new construction of the EHS on the north side. So that would be an option to expand space at this building. And then this is scheme 5, and this is basically taking the old library space, demoing it, and then adding a building onto that end of the Shattuck Street building, which would be for, it would be like a new community center concept. And as you can see, the COA EHS are no longer located at the north site. So this was another option that they proposed, and it would basically be more of COA EHS, Park and Recreation, and probably the Veterans agent in that building located on the south side of the campus, which is another possibility. But that entails, as I stated, the demolition of the vacated library space. And the library is still located on the north side throughout all of these proposals. And then this is scheme 6, which is basically showing the construction of a new community center on the south side and a construction of a new town hall and a LCTV on the north side. So this would be renovation, demolition, renovation, and new construction on scheme 6. And that would be what the footprint would look like. So what we wanted to do was to ask the board to get their feedback on the initial presentation by LLB, and just try to get your feeling of which schemes you might like, you might not like, and just see if we could build some form of a consensus. We did show this presentation to the working group, the
Friends and COA
Friends and
chairs,
COA
basically.
chairs, yeah. So they were gonna take it back to their groups and run through the presentation with them to get their feedback. But we're really looking, the Space Needs Working Group is really looking for feedback from the board, just to see which scenarios you are interested in learning more about, which ones that you feel are off the table, and what next steps you might want to take in this process.
To be honest, the scheme that I saw that was most appealing was actually scheme number 5, which has very little detail in it. I think once we get into the part of going into the hill down there, we're gonna run into more problems than what the library had, because the contour of the land gets harder and harder, and I think that puts us off in years. I think if we stay with a campus type thing and we go on to the end there, and maybe it doesn't even look like that, but
Right.
we do make that section bigger. It includes everything, and I bet it's the most economical way of doing it, because you're on the same level. You're not looking at other land that you're gonna have to cut into.
Yeah.
Have it designed, have it engineered. I mean, this has to be engineered too, but not to the extent of all those other schemes. So
Right.
I would love to see us go forward with some kind of
More detail.
more detail on this.
On scheme 5?
Yeah.
Right.
I haven't second thoughts now, because actually I agree with Joe. But,
I mean,
no, I do, for a variety of reasons. I think,
you could even build that building closer to the road too. I mean, it doesn't,
True.
we don't have to leave that pavement in there, that little.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to see more what those possibilities are for a variety of reasons. I like preserving the integrity of this building. It's survived at least one renovation, or 2 expansions and 1 renovation already, and structurally, I think there's more life here and there's history here.
Right.
I wouldn't want to give up on that too quick from a taxpayer lookout perspective. I haven't heard, maybe that comes out in more detail later on, it probably would, whether or not there's downside to You know, if you're gonna knock something down the other end of the current library end of it and rebuilding there rather than building in the woods, it just seems like that has to be a more economical model. And, you know, and if we're making efforts here to accommodate, or the goal anyways here is to accommodate what everybody would ideally want, well, then we're really setting a high bar, you know, so, I mean,
Right.
that's, if you can do that in a model that's essentially like this, then, you know, I'm not closing the door on any of the options. Very much want to hear other people's feedback on it, but
Right.
I'm intrigued by that. And before I forget, kudos to you, Chuck, the group, and the, this is sometimes information that's not easy to convey,
Right.
but especially in the color version, not so much the black and white version we
Right.
get handed, it's very easy to follow.
Yeah.
And I like that. And, you know, and it kind of sells itself too in terms of the rationale behind the deck building, which I've gone back and forth. I didn't like it at first, then when I walked it, I liked it, but then now that I see your report, it's like, I
Right.
understand what the issues are, I get it.
Right.
Whatever. So
Right.
Yeah, I think we're at the point now that we say, okay, we eliminate that. And now, do we eliminate?
or give somebody a chance to hop up and make a strong case why we shouldn't, but I mean, otherwise, you know.
Right.
But
Right.
I think as we narrow it down, we actually get closer to actually having something done.
Right.
Instead of prolonging it and say, now that's one of the reasons I don't like to go to the north side, I guess, because then you have to go through a whole set of designs and.
Right. And the architects did say that the north site, it's a tricky site.
Yeah, it's.
And they said, you know, once they dive into it in more detail, it might not even be a viable option. They
Right.
did concede that to us, which I appreciate, but they just are looking for us now to say, you know, I'd like to give them two options, and just say, can you dive into those a little bit more, in more detail? But I agree with
That
you.
makes sense. I mean, expressing a preference doesn't mean that's the only thing I think we ought to
Yeah.
pursue, but that would be it's the one
But I
I'm
mean,
most
some of
intrigued
these
by.
scenarios, I just look at them like that would just never work, and even, you know, trying to accomplish something in the short term, you can look at some of those options and just be like, that's just gonna take years and years. Not that, I mean, we know there's time constraints anyways with any municipal project, but, I like scenario 5 as well, but I also like, and I also like scheme 2, call it scenario, scheme 5, and I like scheme 2 as well, personally.
How about
So-
Chuck? Do you have any idea what his preferences are?
I think he was leaning towards scheme 2, but not to say that he wasn't open to scheme 5, so,
Well, then maybe.
Most of the discussions we had in the group was 2 and 5, not to say that
right,
there wasn't consideration of other ones. It's just those seem to meet the general needs, but then we also discussed and recognized the difficulty of potential needing further explorations for the north site and the difficulty that that may pose.
right,
Also, I mean, this may be a phased approach regardless of whether we pick scheme 2 or scheme 5, but if we can narrow to 2 schemes, we can ask them to look into costs a little bit further and feasibility a little bit further.
right,
And have those discussions, because they're looking for some more direction from the town at
Right.
this point.
Can you ask them too, that if they did go with scheme, or if further investigation of scheme 5, whether they could look at the current library and whether it could be added onto in the front and the back?
as opposed to demo.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
economically, is it more feasible, and you can still get, if you add on to the back, you could still get ample space for
right,
what some departments might need.
right, is a complete demo of that end of the building necessary,
Right,
so,
right. I think no matter what we do, we will, the scheme 5 scenario will likely trigger all of the requirements for ADA and code.
I think we can
So
accept
no
that.
matter what scenario we look
Right.
at, you know, I think we're in it for those things.
right. Yep,
Yeah, when I said having it remain, I didn't mean to say that I knew that we'd have to go
Sure.
with the
Right.
compliance.
right,
From the peanut gallery, if it's okay.
Sure.
Because scheme 5 is cool and because this building has a flat roof, they could design it so that you could build up the road. So you could have Littleton's first skyscraper in 50 years. But seriously.
No, seriously.
For roof
yeah.
deck?
You could do a 3-story building now, but then it could turn into a 5-story building. And it would go up. Just an idea. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you for your feedback. Thank you.
The 8 o'clock item is a continuation of the public hearing, so that's a time certain, right?
Yes.
So
Right.
maybe we can work from the back of the agenda,
That sounds good to
knock
me.
off some stuff.
Yep.
Hate to leave all you folks alone here in 15 minutes, but,
We
Go-
could
Go
do-
Huskies.
oh, listen.
No, I'm sorry.
We could do, do you want to do town administrator, or why don't we start with minutes?
Sure. I have
Consent, start from the back?
just one item there. There are 2 sets there, right?
Yes.
And I like the way they're written. On the February 4th one, though, in the list of the board members present, Lisa Flanagan was also there from the Board of Health, so she didn't make the list as either attending or being absent, but she was there.
Thank you for catching that.
So we just need a
Of course,
motion.
my computer's timed out, so it's doing a lot of thinking.
Scrolling through. So what was your comment on, Paul, which date, the,
The 4th, the
4th?
minutes for the 4th.
Okay.
It's just adding her name to the list of Board of Health members that were present at that meeting.
okay, so, ready for motion? Move that the Board of Selectmen vote to approve the regular session meeting minutes of January 27th, 2020, and February 4th, 2020 as amended.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
And the town administrator, is there something we can knock off there?
I think we could do potentially all 3 of them. So for the first one, support letters for Beaver Brook at Great Road intersection, there's a draft letter in the packet so that the board can consider what we would be asking potentially for Westford and Groton to provide feedback on and support the town in its pursuit to requesting transportation improvements funding from the state and from our.
Is this something that's needed, a requirement that?
It's not a requirement. It was actually suggested to us by our former town administrator, who's the chair on our MAPC, our representative on MAPC, and because he's obviously very close to that discussion and has his ear to the ground. So I think it's a positive thing to move forward with.
No, I didn't know that it was actually a requirement
Nope,
that the towns
nope.
were affected.
No, we would, in this scenario, we would ask for Groton and Westford for their letters of support, and then we would write our own letter as well to be potentially brought back to the February 24th meeting for finalization of our own letter. Our letter would probably get into things like traffic count and have a little bit more detail relating to it, so that it could, really poise the discussion, position the discussion.
Okay, do we have a motion on that one?
Move that the board authorize the town administrator request letters of support from the towns of Groton and Westford for the improvements to the Beaver Brook and Great Road intersection.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, that's done. Now, Church Meadows contract.
So in the packet is a copy of the management agreement as drafted by council in the in light of my discussions with Scott Matheson on behalf of Frank Matheson Jr. And the only changes from this version, from the document that was contained in the request for proposals, which the board moved forward and we published and advertised, is that obviously it fills in the necessary information. It fills in that this agreement would be with Mr. Frank Matheson Jr. It fills in that the term is commencing on or about February 1st, 2020, which we're slightly past at this point. It fills in the fact that the proposed annual payment to the town is $200 for the use of this property. And what it also does in the exhibit is detail out the Matheson's plans in terms of how they plan to begin utilizing the land. You'll see that there is discussion on the fact that the property has not been active for a few years and needs to be rejuvenated, that they would begin by planting oats in the first year to improve the organic matter, and then go through the process of testing the land, the soil, to figure out what alternative options they have to harvest and grow crops. It may be that they continue to grow oats depending upon the soil conditions, or it may be that they may expand into further opportunities such as things like carrots or other types of vegetables or the like. And their responsibilities are outlined by this agreement, pretty straightforward. I think that at some point in the future, the board may separately, independent of this process, want to look at, and Joe, you had brought this up at some point, whether or not we should look at the location of the community gardens. But that would be probably separate from this agreement, and we could take on subsequent to signing the agreement.
Okay.
So at this point, I don't know if the board's ready to move forward. This is a document that Scott Matheson, on behalf of Frank Matheson, has looked at and is comfortable with, based on our discussions. There would be, notice, there is an opportunity for the board to request reports from them from time to time as to, their operations and how things are going. And there are also certain requirements that they are, items that they're required to submit on a regular basis. Not sure if there are any questions?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. What are they, what they're required to submit on a regular basis?
So in order to apply, the specific point I was making there is in order to apply any pesticides and herbicides that they're required to submit third-party insecticide, pesticide manager reports. As far as periodical notices, if you look at section 15, sorry, not section 15. I think it's section
Notices?
6, yeah. Is that? What section is that?
On page 18.
Sorry, it's the bottom of 17 is reporting.
Okay.
So they are required from time to time to submit a completed, so there's item B, as requested by the town from time to time, prearranged informal quarterly reports and/or meetings in the field or office to discuss ongoing and/or developing plan issues. That would be the plan being the exhibit that outlines their plans to plant oats and then test the soils. And then any scheduled formal meetings to review completed activities and planned activities, including the in-kind services that are specified in the plan. And as I mentioned, the submission of pesticide application reports, and then finally nutrient application reports.
So subsection C, scheduled formal pre-season annual meetings to review completed activities and planned activities. So who's responsible for scheduling those?
I guess we could define that today, because
Yeah.
that's a great question.
Right, and I guess that's with respect to subparagraph B, as requested by the town from time to time,
I did discuss, believe it or not, I did discuss a
I,
specific session
you know
with
how
Mr.
that, so
Matheson.
that's just,
I
that's
know.
putting it back on our plate. We have to remember to follow through, and we know sometimes that doesn't always
I
work out.
actually, I proposed to Mr. Scott Matheson that we actually modify that language to have a more regular time period, and interestingly, that, you know, in fairness, his comment back was, well, I don't want to miss something and then have a situation where the board is unhappy with me, so I'd actually prefer the language that was in the RFP to begin with.
Right.
Okay, well, I can bring that forward and see.
I mean,
how
I
the
think
board-
quarterly reports might be a bit much, but if we could maybe coincide that with the scheduled formal preseason annual meeting, just kind of make it an annual.
Most, yeah, annual or twice a year, but what
Yeah.
you intend to do for the upcoming year and how the past year went.
Come on
you
in
know,
and see
whatever.
us,
What are you
yeah.
gonna do? What did you do?
Yeah.
Right, there you go.
Do you want to specify the timeframes, rough timeframes of that? Does the board have a position on that?
Preseason, I would think you'd want to be doing it in December, or November, December.
Yeah.
I really think we only need.
I apologize if I missed this, but does the Ag Commission have they reviewed this at all? or-
So if, the discussion back when we began this process was to have the Board of Selectmen go through this process, because there might have been an Ag Commission applicant in that came out from the RFP.
Yeah.
So they have not taken a look at these documents, to my
Well, all
knowledge.
right, well, not,
It was the point of the ad, it came down to, at a meeting that I attended, that they wanted input, whatever, but they found out that if they had control over the document and everything else, then no one from their committee could even make an application. Anyone in their family could make an application. So
right.
they said back to us, we'd like the Board of Selectmen to have control of that.
that's fine, but we're denying ourselves the one outfit that might actually provide some useful advice to us. I mean, there's gotta be a way of getting proper input, I mean, especially since we're down to a identified, contractor, right, candidate. I mean, I'd make sense to have somebody look that over and say.
Well, why don't we
"You're
go back to
missing
the
X."
candidate and say, hey, this is what we're thinking.
times of the
What
year
do you
would you like to-
recommend?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just, if there are even other items that would be obvious to a member of the Ag Commission, but not us, that we're not seeing, what sort of stuff should we be including? Does that still apply, that concern, if we've already basically done the RFP, we've identified a candidate, and we're at the point of signing a contract? I mean,
Well, town council was very concerned when we first brought that up, that it's the only way you could open it up to.
I get that at the beginning, but
Yeah.
we're past that now, right?
But wouldn't that person still, that person would be reviewing what he's,
Well, that person would have to recuse themselves. The question becomes whether or not other members would feel the need to disclose or recuse themselves, depending upon their personal relationships or otherwise.
Yeah, that's a
Could
good
the
point.
Ag Commission nominate one of their members who does not have any interest?
Conflict?
Yeah, conflict, there's no potential of applying for this now or in the future?
well, I bet Will Pickett would do it in a heartbeat. He was up there with Nina and I and went through the whole process of walking the land, and so I bet there's somebody on the committee that wouldn't mind doing it.
Maybe we get council's advice on that, how to structure it. I just think it's crazy
And,
that,
the
they're
specific-
supposed to advise us on ag issues, but we can't talk to them about this because there might be a conflict.
So are there specific sections of this document that the board wishes to have the Ag Commission weigh in on, or a member
The
of
whole
the Ag
thing.
Commission?
I think they ought to just look the whole thing over and say, I mean, they're not gonna be looking at it with a legal eye, but they'll be looking at it from a practical eye, I would think, it ought to cover this, it ought, you haven't accounted for X, Y, or Z, or you have, maybe you have, whatever.
I think my only reservation is that we were attempting to get this closed, and it would have been ideal to have brought this forward to the candidates
Yeah.
sooner, because I know that they've been, at one point,
That's
they
fine. Well,
emailed
if I was
requesting.
aware earlier that they weren't involved in my process, I would have raised the issue earlier, but.
Well, I think we can resolve it though. All we have to do is take out the language that says scheduled formal preseason annual meetings to review completed activities. Why don't we just strike the preseason? And then scheduled formal annual meetings to review completed activities and planned activities as noticed by the board with 3 months of notice or something, and then we can figure out when we want those. And
Yeah.
we can
I don't have a
informally
problem with
engage
that. I don't really have a
council.
problem with any of the details. I just think as a matter of process, we ought to be.
Oh, you were talking more broadly.
Ne-
Okay.
So where did this document derive from, Nina, originally?
Council had brought this document forward to this body back in December or November, and this is a copy of the draft management agreement, basically, that this language in particular was the language that was brought forward back then. It was council drew up this document.
Okay.
Drew up the document, but was reviewed by the, was still under review with the.
That's another good point, and I wasn't a part of that, that's the meeting you were at.
The meeting
It
I was
was
at, they
reviewed
went
by
through the
the
whole
Ag
thing,
Commission.
Brad Mitchell led it from their viewpoint, and we had.
Their input
This
at one
contract?
point
Okay,
felt-
so it has,
okay.
it has had that
Okay,
review.
they looked at
All
it.
right, that's all I was really
Yeah,
asking.
and came to the final point.
Fine.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But in going forward, maybe we can get a little guidance from council that, you know, annually, they're really the folks that ought to be taking a quick look-see over operations, make sure they're working.
Yeah, that's what.
And let's just leave it at annually,
Yeah.
and let someone who
Has no conflict.
has no conflict, but also knows when the right time in the
Right.
annual cycle is to go through this.
Yeah.
Participate and tell us.
And we can also make that person the one that's responsible for remembering all our
Yes.
obligations.
I do think, and in fairness, I do think, to Cindy's point, and it's something that I feel pretty strongly about too, it's helpful if the applicant was responsible for that, but it's also, in fairness to them, we're not, we can't dictate or predict what future boards are gonna say, and I
Right.
don't necessarily want a future board to be upset that we missed a day in one month, for instance, in terms of, so I see both sides of the issue, and I think we can probably move forward either way.
Okay.
Okay, we're close to a hearing time.
I have a quick suggestion for you on this contract. First, you should ask for copies of the soil sit tests. The town owns that property, they should know what the soil is about. So because they're going to test the soil, you should just have a copy on file, so if down the road another farmer wants to come in, they won't be starting from scratch. And I also suggest early November for your annual meetings for farmers. The crops are in, and they're planning next year, and we'll have a good vision for what to expect. Their crop plan next year, they'll be finalizing their crop plan in January.
So before the board votes, considering the commentary, does the board wish to change any language in this agreement?
Take that under advisement, but I'm comfortable changing language. I mean, it's probably legit, but it could probably be accomplished without changing the language too.
I guess my expectation is that it would be in what we've already requested. That we've got a copy of the various plans, nutrient application reports, pesticide reports.
Okay.
Maybe,
I'm taking it in advance.
yeah, put it in, make sure it gets into the minutes and we don't lose track of it that way.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll move that the board authorize the town administrator to sign the Church Meadows Management Agreement with Frank Matheson Jr. of Springbrook Farm amended as discussed.
Second.
Motion's been made and second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, can we do C real quick?
Yes,
'Cause we have to-
but just very quickly, if I may, so it was to remove the word scheduled, formal, pre-season, to remove the word scheduled and pre-season and get rid of the parentheses for annual, is that right, Chase?
Right.
Okay. The next item, I think, is just a motion. We only have the fire departments in front of us tonight. In the future, when I've received, and when I've requested and received the forms from the police department, we'll have that one in front of us. I don't know if the board wishes to have further discussion on that gift.
I don't think it's needed, we just need a motion.
Move that the board vote to accept Middlesex Savings Charitable Foundation's gift to the fire department in the amount of $10,000.
Second.
Motion been made and second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. Thank you. Item number 9 is a continuation of earth removal, 64 Spectacle Pond Road. I need a motion to reopen the soil hearing.
Move that the board vote to reopen the soil removal hearing relating to 64 Spec Pond Road.
Second.
Motion been made and second to reopen, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Council?
Good evening, I'm sorry it got me again, but I think I pulled the short straw tonight. I think that letters have gone back and forth between the new Assistant Town Administrator and Mr. Green, stating that the engineer expects to have a full report and to be here on the 24th to present before you. He's got the existing conditions done, he's got most of the elevations done and is ready to present on the 24th, but not tonight. Mr. Green's in Florida. I was not able to reach the engineer today, but I'm asking for continuance till February 24th.
And all this information was developing today, and it's my understanding that Attorney Gould was working to try to get the engineer here this evening, so there was a lot of information in flux as to what was going to be available for tonight's meeting.
The only problem I have, Sharon, is that this has gone on for 2 or 3 months, and we've got nowhere, and he just seems to ignore us. And it's a situation that I'm not comfortable with at all, the way he did it, the way the company did it, and we're not acting on it, it's just he sends you down to ask for continuation.
I understand, Mr. Chair. All I can tell you is I tried all day to reach Mr. Donahoe. I had informed my client last meeting that I wouldn't come again without the engineer, so he's well aware of that. And he called me today and said that he had sent email back and forth with
Joe Layden.
Joe Layden. And I did see those letters back and forth, and then I called Joe and said I couldn't reach either the engineer. I did reach Seth, but I didn't reach the engineer, and I haven't confirmed that what Sean Green told me I haven't confirmed with the engineer. But Joe Layden said that he got the message that the 24th was a certainty, that Seth was coming on that, Seth being the engineer, coming on that date, but that someone had to appear tonight to ask for a continuance to that date.
Okay, 'cause I know that since our last meeting too, it appears that Mr. Green somehow went and covered up a drain, which caused a water problem, so he's done nothing at all. He put that a silt fence, whatever it is, and that's fallen down because it hasn't been taken care of. He hasn't put any hay bales, he hasn't done a thing since, and I know you're here representing him, you probably don't know those answers, but this is the frustration that I have, a frustration of neighbors, that it just gets continued for another 2 weeks and nothing gets resolved.
I would be happy to reach out to Seth Donahoe. He's with Dillis and Mish. He's the engineer that was retained. Like I said,
How long have they been engaged on this?
Since the beginning.
Since the beginning,
Since the
okay.
beginning. And if you recall, in the beginning, Seth Donahoe made it clear that there were weather conditions. Now, there haven't been weather conditions for a month. We spoke about that. And I don't know what he's done and why it's taken this long. But I would reach out to him and confirm to the board through Nina and Joe that Seth himself answers me that he's prepared to present at the next meeting. Because I have just heard from Sean Green, I haven't heard from Seth.
Anything else? Okay.
Well, I just would reiterate the authority we gave you before. I mean, between now and the 24th, I mean, anything, I mean, we at the previous meeting voted to give Joe and council and Nina or whoever the authority to do whatever is necessary in terms of enforcement to make things happen.
And that letter basically pointed out if he wasn't here, then we'd proceed with the legal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this has been going on since November 18th was the first hearing, and the letter that he acknowledges he received from the board was pretty specific from the town administrator of what our course of action would be if the event he didn't comply with the terms of that letter prior to this meeting, and he didn't comply, and you're saying he's in Florida? So.
With all due respect to the board, I appreciate the aggravation with Mr. Green. However, I would like the opportunity to have the engineer come forward and give you some answers, because that hasn't happened yet. And the engineer was engaged, he's been retained. I confirmed with him that he received his retainer money prior to the last meeting. So I know that's not blowing smoke, and I did confirm that he did the existing conditions and that he had all the information he needed. I don't know if the neighbor is here, Mr. Dutcher?
Mr. Dutch is here.
Have you seen the engineer on site?
Yeah, they were out 3 weeks ago.
So they're on site, and I know he's drafted some stuff. I just don't know what it is without
Right,
talking to him.
right.
But if we're granting a continuance per the request to the 24th, we're essentially guaranteeing that nothing will happen between now and then, right? Or will something
No, I'm
happen?
gonna reach out to the engineer and have him put in writing to me what is done and what he's accomplished and what he proposes to have in front of you on the 24th. And I'll go around Mr. Green now and go directly with Mr. Donahoe.
And I guess what you've described, Ms. Gould, is part of my concern, because that, getting the engineer in here is step one, right? There are a bunch of steps that come after this, and if every step takes 2 months to effect, we're gonna be here until next January.
Unless there's some penalties in the pipeline, that's.
Well, that was gonna be my next question. I mean, filing a lawsuit is costly and it can be counterproductive, especially with what we're trying to achieve here. Can we impose, I think council had mentioned one time, we could impose a bond? What other recourse
We need
do we
the
have?
application. We need an application to require them to bond against for the work.
Okay.
We don't even have the application.
Right,
Well, I think we have an incomplete application.
right.
And the problem with a bond is you don't know what to bond without knowing what work is necessary to do.
Right.
That's the problem. And I will say on the record that Mr. Green is well aware that a bond needs to be imposed for the amount of the work that needs to be done.
Okay.
And I believe there's equity in the property to secure his performance under
Right.
that bond.
Right.
I don't know what to tell you without
Is
the
his
engineer
control of the
explaining it.
property been, that was in question?
That's done, and
That's
I
done.
furnished evidence
Yeah,
to Nina
okay.
many months ago, or a month ago. I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
what was
most
that?
recent meeting, I thought it was.
No, it was, I did not come to the last meeting. I told Mr. Green I wouldn't come without.
Oh, this was
some-
the photographs you're referring to.
No, the fact that the mortgage foreclosure had stopped.
Oh, yes, and I shared that with
That
the
was
board.
over a
Yep,
month ago.
yep.
I don't have any problem if you state that if he's not at the next hearing, that there'll be a per diem penalty. I have no problem with that.
I don't know what authority we have to issue it. Do we?
I'm not aware of any opportunity to do that, but we do anticipate Attorney Heap here this evening for the 8:30 discussion on HCA's. You know, we could always continue this hearing till later tonight and then ask him that question if the board desires.
I think that'd be wise moving on that side. We'll wait to see what Chris Heap says later on tonight. I don't want to make you stay, that's.
Right. Well, whether you had been requesting a continuance or not, we'd probably be continuing it anyway, just to get it resolved. And I would think our standing order should remain the same. Joe's authorized to do what's right, whatever it takes to make it happen as quick as possible. So anything that can be done between now and the 24th, fine, but it'd probably be on our agenda on the 24th again, whether you were here on his behalf or not.
Does that include initiating enforcement actions?
I would, that's what we said before, right?
So, right, so, I mean, if you were to, this evening, I think you have a number of different options, as you were all saying. You could continue the hearing to the following week, and if in the following, not the following week, but the following meeting, if the following meeting there isn't information available satisfactory to the board, then initiate the filing of this to the Superior Court seeking enforcement and a preliminary injunction as outlined in our letter. I think you could also close the hearing tonight and do the same thing, but I also recognize that there may be value in waiting for the couple weeks because it may get drawn out. But again, weighed with the fact that this seems to be an ongoing issue and continuing. So I think that if I'm hearing the board correctly, perhaps the board's looking to just have a conversation with our attorney tonight, confirm that the approach of potentially continuing the hearing to the 24th and including on the agenda the proper notice to say that we may be having the board vote to file with the Superior Court on the 24th if necessary. Certainly, that's the board's option
Right.
this evening as well.
I think that's the avenue we could take.
Can the town take steps to mitigate the impacts so that the neighbors aren't affected as much as they're currently affected?
I'd like to get some opinion from town council on that, because part of it's private property, and I
Right.
don't know as though, I mean, we may be able to do things within the town's right-of-way, but I understand that, if I'm not mistaken, this is not anywhere close to a town right-of-way.
Okay.
So the clarification from town council would be beneficial.
Okay.
Through the chair, did Mr. Dutcher have any communication with the engineer at all when he was on the site?
No. What about as far as having him uncover the catch basin to stop the flooding, like now, instead of 2 weeks from now?
And that, Mr. Chair, is that catch basin, if I may, on generally private property?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that that would be the request of the board. Perhaps the board could say that unless that catch basin is uncovered, then, if the catch basin isn't uncovered by a certain date, then the board will file, perhaps the board would like to use that as an option to compel for that to occur.
And through the chair, what's covering the catch basin and where is it located, please?
And the other thing is,
Good
I don't know
pictures
if it's a
of it,
siltation, if it's a siltation barrier that's gonna prevent silt from going in the catch basin, or if it's actually some sort of cover, so to Attorney Gould's point.
It's a catch basin that takes the water from 4 different properties, his being one of them, and he's covered it over.
What do you cover it with?
He put a piece of silt fence over it and then a bunch of dirt.
And again, through the chair, I don't know enough about that catch basin. I will certainly immediately issue a memorandum about tonight's hearing and request that the catch basin be uncovered. But I don't know if there's a dispute between neighbors about whether that catch basin is catching property through a properly recorded easement or not. Now, I don't know that answer, and I'm not suggesting that I'm correct. I'm just maybe thinking that there's a neighbor dispute that's gone on for a long time about those things. I will tell him the catch basin needs to be uncovered whether or not that's in dispute until such time as this board is satisfied that your concerns are resolved.
Part of the issue is depending on where that catch basin discharges and the fact that the site hasn't been stabilized, you may not want it to flow freely. In other words, there are lots of things that you put in catch basins to capture sediment in situations like this, when it's well-designed and well-engineered, so that you're not just flushing sediment, who knows where, I don't know where this catch basin goes. It may be a prudent engineering measure to mitigate this sediment, or it may be irrelevant, I don't know. I think we want to think about this. It would be very nice if there was, say, an engineer who had mapped this and could tell us what's going on.
I can
to
include,
advise us.
I can include in my request of Seth for some preliminary information, even prior to the next meeting, that he discussed that catch basin and why it seems to be covered and what it is catching or not catching and should be catching and not catching, to Mr. Gervick's point.
So either way, we should be able to get some sort of response that can be shared with the board on that before next meeting.
I would certainly use whatever power I have to get to get the engineer to give you
Yes.
those responses and not Mr. Green any longer.
Okay. Through Joe, right, or Nina, or however we get this set up.
Yeah. Before we move off of this, can we vote to give Joe the authority to file an enforcement action if it's so required? I don't want to have to wait, I don't want to file an enforcement action between now and the 24th, but I also don't want to not be able to do so, and would very much trust Joe's judgment.
I'd give him
in
double O status, you know,
whatever it takes.
James Bond fans out there.
Is that something?
I think that's something you could certainly do. I think that the board could potentially vote to authorize Selectman Joe Knox to file with, in conjunction with town council, to file with Superior Court seeking enforcement and a preliminary injunction as determined by him, perhaps.
Yeah, as long as we're all kept in the loop,
Yeah.
and hope it doesn't get
So-
that far.
So moved with the town administrator.
Second.
Motion been made and second, all those in favor?
Right.
Can
We still have the hearing open, so yeah, we can definitely.
Yeah, look,
Hey, look what you walked into.
All right.
you're walking into some questions that we have for you, it has to do with gravel removal.
Sure.
Basically, what enforcement, if we have the letter that we could bring into Superior Court.
Yeah.
Do we have the right to fine him per diem or, you know, every day he doesn't comply with what we've done?
You can do that too. I believe we can do that too, yes. Although I'd have to check the bylaw. Thinking back, there are, I may have to look into that.
Okay.
What is, I mean, but what's the board's preference? I mean, there's a range of enforcement mechanisms that the board can engage in.
Well, I guess right now, the board's frustrated because the gentleman doesn't show up and sends counsel. He had to ask for another continuation that's gone on since November. So we're all set to enforce things, but we want to get some kind of engineering back by the 24th, I guess is what we're saying. But if he makes no actions toward that, if we find out that the engineer's doing nothing and Mr. Green's doing nothing, then we want the right to do that immediately.
And I guess my suggestion then would be that we can impose fines, we can impose daily fines. The only catch with the 21D daily fines is that they are notoriously difficult to collect. We can impose them, but you gotta go to district court, and that can take some time. I would suggest that the most useful enforcement tool the board has available to it is a complaint in Superior Court asking the judge to issue an injunction. And I think, given the amount of time that this has been continued, I think we started this back in November, I think we could, it would be, well, we could go in and attempt to get that injunction, and that injunction would be, they've got to come back in and do all the engineering within a matter of weeks. And if they don't do it, if we get the injunction, and then they don't do it, then the property owner is going to be found in contempt of court, and that is a serious penalty for the board to have behind it. So that's sort of on one end of the enforcement range of tools that you have available to you, but that's, I think, that is likely to be the most effective in terms of getting what you're looking for at this point. And I don't think, in terms of, oftentimes we need to file a complaint to Superior Court, we need a decent amount of lead time to get it going, but on something like this, where we're already familiar with the facts of the case, we could do that in relatively short order, once the board instructed us to do that.
So I guess I read the board right, but Sherry, if you can talk to Mr. Green and tell him that I'll be going out to the check and have the engineer contact Nina or myself and say we're working on it and how to resolve the issue with the catch basin. So something's being done. If nothing's being done, then we will go to court.
So I'm requesting, as I sit here, continuance till the 24th with a report to be forthcoming directly from the engineer before that date.
Prior.
Something done with the catch basin, and an understanding that if on the 24th the engineering isn't forthcoming, we understand that you're going to file an enforcement order with the Superior Court.
Except the one thing I want to make sure too is that in between, if we find out before the 24th that he's done absolutely nothing, say a week from now we find out that he's done nothing, he doesn't anticipate to do anything, then we can file right then.
Right, and the board, just so you know, Attorney Heath, the board did vote to authorize Joe to make that decision mid-period between now and the 24th.
Great.
Okay.
All right. So we'll continue to the 24th and
Did we vote? We did vote. right?
You did
Yeah,
vote,
We had
yeah.
the motion.
Did the motion, you had a second?
Yep.
Is there,
yeah, we voted.
Yeah.
I guess we vote to continue to the 24th with possible action between there that I keep the board informed of completely.
Move to continue the soil removal public hearing relating to 64 Spectacle Pond Road to Monday, February 24th, 2020, at 8 PM to be held in room 103 of 37 Shattuck Street, Littleton.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Wish you luck.
Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Sherry.
Sorry, Todd.
Before, there was one item that I think we had jumped over when I was upstairs relating to the letters, Westford and Groton. We might want to CC the appropriate state reps and senators from Westford and Groton
Oh, good
in
catch.
those
Yep.
as well. Certainly wouldn't hurt to build a broader coalition than just our own representatives.
Assuming the board is in agreement, I will take that.
I assume that went through.
That's fine. That'll be offhand, Senator Kennedy for Westford and Groton, and
Does he cover
Representative,
Groton too?
yeah, and Representative Harrington for Groton. Right.
You all set to move on? Okay. Item number 10, discuss proposal to change Board of Selectmen to Select Board. Discussion.
So I brought this proposal forward to the board. Coincidentally, we received in the mail that day a notification from the MMA that the Massachusetts Selectmen Association has changed the name, was proposing to change the name to the Mass Select Board Association. Joe and I were actually at the meeting at the MMA in Boston when that proposal was brought forward and approved. So it was just a proposal that I wanted to bring forth to the board. Many surrounding communities are changing the name. I can appreciate the fact that the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Selectmen's been in place for many years, but I just feel with today's day and age and following the lead of other communities and the fact that it is a gender-specific title, that it would be more appropriate to change the name of the board to the Select Board.
We were at that meeting too, we had the ability to talk to the selectman from Lexington, and she made the point, and I fell right into this, that it was like 80 or 90% were in favor of the select board, and the only 10% or 20% that was against it was because of tradition. I fall into that tradition thing, but I can easily be persuaded the other way, because times have changed. My only reservation was it was a title that's been going on since the 1700s. And I
Right.
hate to see that go, but that's it. That's, other than that, then it's probably, if the board's in favor, then I'm not gonna hold it up, and it's probably time for that change.
Yes. It seems pretty straightforward to me. I only have operational administrative questions, if we do it. What do we have to change?
So subject to Attorney Heap's clarification or otherwise difference of opinion, my understanding in speaking with Tom Harrington and also our Assistant Town Administrator has experience with this in another community, is that we need to modify the language in both the general bylaw and the zoning bylaw to change any place where Board of Selectmen is written to Select Board. So it'd be 1 or 2 articles, depending upon how we wanted to structure it at a town meeting, and then subject to Attorney General review.
That's fine, unless, although, you know, we've updated the code before, and if the references are throughout the whole document, I mean, I don't know if we want to undertake that cost right now. I wonder if just adopting it by bylaw and then changing the various places where it occurs in language as they come up, or when the next time we do a general review of the code, I guess I'm putting that question to you, Chris, as much as anything, whether it makes sense, because a full rewriting of the code is not a simple or a cheap
Right.
task. I just remember that from past experience. You know.
Yeah, I don't know the intricacies of how, I mean, in a simple fashion, I would think it was simple, but I've also heard it's challenging, and I don't know why, to be honest with you. But I understand that we usually have assistants to help us with making those changes.
I wonder if we could just adopt a bylaw, so, here and after, every place where it's previously written as selectmen, it shall be interpreted as select board, and then rolling forward, the language just changes over time.
Well, I think that's sort of how the warrant articles would read, I think. I think
Okay.
it would just be, I think the warrant articles would just say for the general and the zoning, we're gonna substitute select board everywhere Board of Selectmen currently appears. And just leave it, it might be slightly more complicated than that, but not much. I mean, it's really just a, find and replace, kind of exercise. And that would, at some point, require a reprinting of the printed versions, and a change of the online, of the official code online. But I don't, we probably need to print reversions of both, in due course, eventually. If not on a yearly or every other year kind of basis. So that's how I see it working. But I couldn't honestly say how much it would cost to reprint all of the bylaws. But that's how I see it working.
Yeah, I don't remember how recent it was, but I remember being struck by how much it was much more expensive than ever anticipated, so.
And we're currently working on reviewing our bylaws and our policies and everything anyway, so maybe we could incorporate it in with that.
I'd like to understand why it is complicated, and I don't have an appreciation for it one way or another, so
Right.
that would be interesting for me to learn.
Okay.
Well, you might want to talk with Diane for starters, to take a look at what
I
the
will.
actual, code is.
Don't we outsource that work? Was my understanding that we outsource that work? But I guess I'll look into it.
I don't know.
So I guess the question is, and does the board wish to have further discussion on this in the future? Does the board wish to add this to the list of articles to be presented at a near-term time? And we'll probably have the meeting of the 24th and then the meeting of the 10th to discuss generally articles. And then the warrant will be closing on the 20th, so.
Do you want to draft a proposed motion for the 24th, and then we'll include it in the insertion of the articles?
A motion or the article itself? 'Cause I mean, if the board is in agreement, then I would just go straight to the article,
Okay,
or articles, depending upon how it's.
I believe that we're in agreement. Yeah.
Great.
So we're all set with that?
Yeah.
Host community agreement, Chris. HCA with the G7 Lab, the Littleton Apothecary draft HCL, and the Community Care Collective.
Yeah. So I wanted to come out and give the board an update on how all of the discussions have been going with all of the various HCA applicants. Chuck, been working on those with Chuck. Chuck is taking the lead pursuant to the board's direction, I think, from back in November, to negotiate these HCA's. I've been working with him and with the applicants as well. Each of the, so I think, based on the work that we've been doing, we think we've got 2 of the HCA's in final or reasonably close to final form, and wanted to bring those to in front of the board to talk about. And 1 we're still working on and are still in negotiations with the applicant. The 2 that we think are final or close to final are the ones with CCC for the retail location, G7 Labs for the marijuana testing facility, and we're still in discussions with Littleton Apothecary on the shape of that HCA. I had a conference call. We exchanged various drafts back and forth and had a conference call with them and their council last Thursday. So we're still working with them on that one. So I sent out for the board's review 2 of them. Those are the ones with CCC and G7 Labs. So you should have those in front of you. I can walk you through them or answer any questions if you've had a chance to review them, whatever is the board's pleasure.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a question?
Please.
It just occurred to me, and I saw the drafts of the negotiated ones, that these are for two different types of businesses. However, the one for I'm trying to get the names correct here, for CCC and the other retail one, should we be essentially looking to have the same language for both? Or let me ask the question the other way around. What would be a justification for having any different terms between the two?
I think it would be preferable to the town to have both of the HCA's correspond pretty closely to one another. I guess the only difficulty there is that we're negotiating with two completely different parties.
But how do you defense it after the fact if we have, this, they both came in for the same license and one entity gets a, language that says X, Y, and Z and the other one's A, B, and C? How? Why?
We have attempted to push for identical or near to identical terms in both
Okay.
areas. We haven't.
I screwed it up is what Chris is trying to say.
Who did? How'd you do that?
No. And so your approach would be would be my preferred approach, and I think should be the town's preferred approach. But we are attempting to work with two different parties who don't necessarily want to agree to all of the same things. But we're attempting to work through that with two completely separate parties.
My perspective on it and why I think 90% of the language should be absolutely the same. My perspective on why they should be subtly different is because each party frankly made different promises to us when they were in front of us to enter into those negotiations. And those promises were particularly around certain aspects related to their physical location.
But that part is more to my mind, is the sort of thing that gets settled at the planning board, site issues, right?
And I think the commentary that I've given Chris has been, it is not my intention to overrule the planning board, but I do want to see things. CCC, for example, said, we very much intend to do a fence. And I have no reason to believe that the planning board wouldn't say, of course you have to do a fence. But I also am reluctant to let it out of our control when CCC sat there in front of us and said, we will commit to do a fence. So, okay, well then write it down. Subject to whatever constraints the planning board wants to put on it, I think our agreement should say, yeah, we expect a fence, that's part of the deal. However planning board wants to go about doing that, that's fine, that's on that. But I don't want them to.
I almost wonder if that should be an amendment to the contract, and the contract agreement should be, again, back to, especially on money issues, should be essentially identical. I mean, comparable is liquor license. Two different outfits come in for liquor license. Okay, yours costs $1,000, yours costs $1,500. It shouldn't be that way. Terms ought to be essentially, we're establishing a template, and then whoever rolls in and out in this industry, they're playing by the same rules.
But that would be blind to the physical location aspect.
Again, I think that's the planning board's purview more. Now, I don't mind sending them a memo saying, and I don't even mind having a side agreement, but HTA, it just seems to me that that's essentially a financial agreement between the entity and the town, and I don't feel comfortable that we can reach different terms, we should be reaching different terms for essentially the same activity.
See, I look at our HCA's let's take our HCA with Cooper Farm, for example. The fact that certain things were not memorialized in there, that were done sort of as handshake agreements, hamstrings everyone who comes after that because they don't actually know what the agreement was. As someone who came in after the Cooper Farm HCA was put in place and then trying to adjudicate some disagreement between the applicant and the current board, myself, I don't know what those handshake agreements were, and I think
But-
they belong in the
As
host community
I'll
agreement.
stipulate on process, that's probably messy, wasn't involved in that, so I can blame, whoever was, but neither were you. But this is more or less just the first go-around on what is essentially gonna be a licensing
They will-
activity.
They'll have to go to the planning board for a special permit. And what I attempted to do, I attempted to sort of have it both ways on the site planning stuff by saying that we're capturing the fence and a couple other site planning things, but what we're capturing in the HCA is the sort of minimum level of things that they said they would do in their application, and that the planning board can do something different or more.
Is there a way of separating out, like, essentially the site issues and the financial, the monetary agreement?
I mean, they're both in the draft agreement you have in front of you, they're separate sections.
I know they are, but I mean,
They're,
because I accept that site issues are unique to each property, but I have a tough time getting around the notion that two entities essentially going in to compete in the same business should have any different terms from the town. We should be the umpire, arbitrary, same thing. You get the same deal as that one.
Other than site issues.
Right.
But how is, let's take another one, the site security issues. There's fundamentally, there are different layouts of the buildings, right? Fundamentally different sets of security
Yeah, that's
expectations.
easy for me to parse out. That's, again, all part of the, those are the site and security issue.
Oh,
That's
okay,
all
so
property,
now
yeah.
you're talking
I'm
about,
talking about the financial arrangement versus all the things that are particular to, things that are particular to a building, a site, or whatever, that, an intersection, whatever, all those sort of things are one bag, and then it's the whole thing of, what's your deal with the town, and that's the part that I'm comfortable thinking that we could defensively reach two different deals.
well, and to your point, I think with the one that we've brought forward tonight, we have reached what we think of as the most advantageous financial deal for the town.
Right. Okay.
So on that one, we think we've done literally all we can in terms of the financial aspect of it. So we thought that meant that it was ready to bring in front of you. So I haven't wanted to get too deep into the discussions with the other applicant, other than to say that they're ongoing. But we don't think we've gotten to that point yet. So that.
Are the terms
So-
of disagreement relative to, well, I think since that's a negotiation, we have an identified negotiating party, and we're talking about this, in my estimation, in the board and council, and we're not gonna, I don't wanna supersede the negotiation by engaging with one of the parties here, but are the financial terms essentially agreed to on both parties, or are the points of difference, are they money related, or are they site related?
They are, we're not working on the site issues yet, I think, but I don't know that there will be much, I anticipate there'll be much in the way of disagreement on those. I think we're working on primarily how the agreement would be administered in terms of how it would work, in terms of the financial arrangements between the applicant and the town.
Make my point.
can I jump in with some specific questions about the agreements themselves and the financial aspects of them?
Don't have, another chair?
Starting with G7, that G7 seems pretty, I think G7 very much fits the mold that Paul's looking for, right? If we have a lab in town, here it is, sign it. Across the Commonwealth, are labs getting away with no community impact fee, or is that a unique thing to Littleton? And that may be a matter of policy that we don't want a community impact fee from labs.
Until recently, it was my belief that the lab HCA's were all no community impact fee, were all being done on a no community impact fee basis. Thing that was being, the benefit that was being provided to the town was, for the labs, an offering of lab services.
Yep.
Which,
Up to-
I don't know how likely the town is to ever actually make use of that, but But it's being offered, and we can accept it, and if it's ever of use, we can take them up on that.
Yeah.
There was one that I came across recently, that did include a 3% community impact fee of 3% of the lab's revenue. But I've only seen, I believe, one of those, and that was, in my experience, looking at all of them, an outlier.
With respect to G7, I can't find it in the written version here, but when I was looking up the version that was circulated to us, there's essentially let's call it a reopener for the community impact fee.
Yeah.
But it seemed very loosely defined. How does that work? Let's say we do, because I'm going to tell you, as a matter of policy, I would prefer to have no community impact fee on the labs. I think they should be treated, they don't have a unique community impact if they're well-run. But I also want the reopeners. So how does that play out?
I've never, we're blazing new territory on
Okay.
on all of these, so I've never seen one of a reopener work in this field. But all it says now is that, well, if we can identify and document a actual community impact that the lab is creating that we didn't foresee as we're sitting here right now, we'll negotiate in good faith, and they've agreed that will be responsible for it. That would be a negotiation, and I can't necessarily say how that would go, but they're at least committing in writing they'll negotiate some way of mitigating that impact.
Can we withdraw the HCA at any time? Let's say we get into that situation. What's our leverage to say negotiate with us, or what?
We, as drafted, we couldn't make the HCA go away entirely. You could insist on that as a term, and we can put it in there, but that's not anything we've gotten in there right now. I guess the only other leverage we would have is that the HCA goes away automatically after 5 years, at which point they'll need to come in and get a new one.
But the planning board and their special permits could certainly add elements to that, is that correct?
They could.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Chris, so we're negotiating 3 agreements right now. There's certain language I'm going to refer to G7 laboratories that's just jumping out at me. One is, and I just want to see if these provisions have been universal through all 3 agreements, even though I can't speak to one of them because I've recused myself, but just in general, a general question. So G7 includes an emergency response plan. It includes an enforceability clause. It includes language on page 2, representation as to leasehold. It includes a compliance provision. It includes on page 3 a term of the agreement. Paragraph 6, hours of operation. Paragraph 7 on page 3, real and personal property taxes. Page 4, community support and additional obligations. Paragraph 9 on page 4, non-opposition to application. Page 5, security. Page 5 also includes a cooperation clause. And you can look at the provisions on page 6 as to governing law amendments and waiver, severability, successes and assigns, entire agreement. Is that language that's been carried forward across all 3
I would say, well,
agreements?
we've only got 2 that are reasonably close to being
Right.
final.
But-
So I can't, as we're sitting here right now, speak to the specifics of
Right.
what the 3rd one would look like.
Yeah,
With respect to these 2 that you have for you tonight.
Yeah.
I would say that the language is probably 90% the same. I don't know if the headers correspond exactly, but all of the language is effective.
It couldn't be, because one's 2 pages long and one's,
Well, one's a development agreement.
okay, all right.
They're not, they're different documents.
well, and I guess, to speaking to Paul's point, if we're gonna do this and kind of set a precedent going forward, shouldn't we have, I don't wanna call it a boilerplate agreement, but a template that we're gonna rely on, universally, just with the specific language
Yep.
that I pointed out. To me, I don't know if it seems germane, it would be germane to any applicant that would come before us.
There may be some, I think that's almost always true. There may
Yeah.
be some subtle differences between the retail and the lab.
Right,
but-
yeah,
but-
exactly.
But we could certainly attempt to make the number of paragraphs, the headers, and all of the sort of boilerplate language apply identically in both of the two.
Right.
That's something we could.
It just makes more sense to me personally.
Another question on, well, it's actually now comparing and contrasting these. If we go to CCC's community impact fee, help me understand the basis for the lack of documentation for the community impact fee. I guess what I want to make sure I understand where we are and that it's on solid legal footing there. Because when I read the statutes, and the statute says shall be documented, it seems pretty unambiguous, and yet CCC seems willing to waive any documentation. So are we gonna get screwed out of a 3% community impact fee?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
What the statute says is that all documents associated with what we're using the community impact fee for are public records. It doesn't necessarily create an affirmative obligation on the town to provide all of this to the applicant upfront. So I guess what you've got in here is what I regard to be standard language in terms of HCA's that have been entered into by all the other towns thus far. And you've got an applicant who is willing to agree in writing that there are some challenges associated with documenting these costs, identifying these costs, and documenting the town's spending of that money to pay for those costs. None of which necessarily would prevent the applicant from a couple years down the road saying, hey, we'd really like to see the public records that you've either been generating or not to document these costs. But at least as an initial matter, what we've got is an applicant agreeing to provide some measure of flexibility in terms of the accounting for, the documenting of and the accounting for these costs.
Doing something that's,
Mr. Chair, I represent both G7 and Littleton Apothecary.
okay.
So Shankar is not here, and you've talked a little bit about a lot of issues. So I just wanted to raise a point in Shankar's absence relating to the hours of operation. Essentially, every other municipality that hosts a laboratory does not have as restrictive of an hours operation requirement. And the rationale is that a testing laboratory it's about volume. It's about how much you can process and how quickly you can do it. The margins are incredibly low because the equipment is incredibly expensive. So if he has 6 or 8 hours fewer to operate in, it will be at the outset a competitive disadvantage against the other 3 licensed testing laboratories up and running today. I believe there are 3 total that I'm aware of throughout the rest of the state that are in various stages of the municipal process. And again, there are incredible differences between a retail operation and a testing laboratory, both in terms of the volume of cannabis inside and of course the public-facing nature. So a testing laboratory, it's going to be like a Quest Diagnostics. There's going to be, Sprinter vans coming occasionally, dropping off teeny tiny samples, and what happens is if you get a backlog and you start getting a reputation for taking longer than the other labs, all of the pricing is virtually identical because, again, the margins are so low. The commission has detailed requirements about what batches have to be tested, basically 10 pounds per every harvest in a couple different increments. So it's about how many tests you can process And so again, if you're restricting this state lab to the lowest operating number of hours per day out of the rest of the state, there's no way he'll ever have a success. So,
Can I ask a point of clarification, Mr. Chairman? I thought we had proposals before us that were agreed upon.
There is one item that was left open in the G7, the draft G7 HCA, which you have in front of you, which is the hours of operation.
That's the only.
Which is why there's blanks in it.
That's,
Oh, okay.
so I should have, could have explained that earlier. But I think an earlier draft had, I think.
I just don't want to venture down the road where we agreed upon a process for negotiating, and it's like, oh, well, you have a public meeting, so we're gonna show up and negotiate with you,
This
you
is
know,
what- this-
that notwithstanding.
With respect to the lab's hours of operation, a draft that had been kicked back and forth during the negotiations with Chuck had initially standard business hours for the operation of the lab. The applicant asked that those be expanded well into the early morning and I think also into the late hours of the evening. And Chuck decided that that was a point on which he would rather defer to a discussion of the whole board rather than try to figure that out with the applicant. So at some point, so that's the one open item, I think, in the G7 agreement is what would the board want to see in terms of hours of operation of the facility? Or is that maybe something that you would want to defer to the planning board as part of the special permit process?
Can I ask you, Council, what the normal, what hours do other labs have?
So, Mr. Shankar Gautam, the owner of G7, had sent an email to both Attorney Heap and Chuck outlining it, and obviously I don't really want to read every word for it, but essentially, it doesn't mean that they're going to be open 24/7. They just need to have the option to, if there is a backlog, again, it's about how much they are able to process in a given time, that they need to have. So for instance, Pro Verde Lab in Milford has a second shift from 3 to 11. And then there are equipment runs that don't necessarily require a lab technician to be sitting in front of it, but periodically checking, and again, I'm not a scientist, but there is process involved that can't always be left done overnight if it's a certain step in what they're testing. I don't particularly know how they test, but the basic argument is that if you restrict the hours to lower than anyone else in the state, that's from day one sort of dooming his business. If he is later in producing a test result, he won't get repeat customers.
What are the requested hours? Perhaps we could start there.
Yeah.
Sure. So as Attorney Heap said, there's an additional 9 to 5. And Shankar has requested, if there's a significant backlog, he'd like to be able to operate until midnight. And let's see. So, yeah, so he'd extend the hours, the request would be to extend till 12 a.m. midnight. And he emphasizes again that the turnaround time of the sample is sort of what makes or breaks their business model. So I guess, yeah, he's not asking for 24 hours. It's just till midnight if there is a sufficient backlog to warrant.
And starting when in the morning?
Yeah.
Starting at, I think we'd probably want as early as possible, so 6. But that's, again, it's not a high number of employees that have to come into the facility. And I'm not familiar with the schedules of any other testing labs for any other substance, but my assumption would be that they test when they have tests to be run.
Yeah, just for clarification, so of all the possible items, for whatever reason, that's one that Chuck didn't have a recommendation on? Can you flesh out maybe what, I mean, if that's what the request was, what was the counter, or was there a counter?
There
I
was
feel uncomfortable being the least informed people in this process to make a decision on the fly here. I'd much rather be, because I assume you folks both look at models in other communities, touch base with the police chief, take into consideration other issues, and here we're being asked to say, whoop, it's a blank spot, fill it in, that's.
There was no counter from Chuck or I back to them on this. This was, the request came in and to expand from 6 to midnight. I think Chuck, I don't want to put words in Chuck's mouth, but I think that seemed like a lot. But then on the other hand, it's not clear that there's going to be a whole lot of impact from the running of this equipment past normal business hours. So that, it was one on which Chuck wanted to get the opinion of the whole board.
So, if I may, Mr. Chair, sorry. So, looking at the location of this business, it's an industrial commercial site. There's a marketing company in that building. There's Cherry Stone Furniture in that building. Behind it, I think there's many other industrial, commercial properties. There's no residential homes located near this property. I can appreciate the need for the business owner to run his equipment and be open and flexible for an extended period of time. I mean, just looking at the requested hours, 6 AM to midnight, and looking at who it might impact, I don't see that it's gonna impact
On its face, I don't have a
anybody.
problem with that either.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, we've been very methodical about all this, and then here we get, you know,
Well,
everything, we have a proposal and everything, except that one, you know,
Right.
pull something out of the air on it.
I guess I look at it as, there are two different things we have to think about here. One is the delivery window, and one is the operational window. We're not
Right.
telling anybody else in that complex when they can print
No.
things, when they can build furniture.
Right.
I don't see a public interest in constraining that. I do see a certain public interest potentially in constraining the delivery hours of product. And if, my understanding is your client is willing to work with the delivery hours of 9 AM to 5 PM?
Correct.
Run your equipment whenever the heck you want.
Right.
Again, on the surface, I don't have a problem with it. It's just, why are we getting, you know,
Why is this the hangup?
yeah, and, you know,
Yeah.
we have a proposal except for, you know, whatever, you know,
Well,
this part.
Yeah, well, maybe they honestly wanted the board's input on that, since,
Well, and I think in fairness, probably, and first thing I would say is, I wonder if we've had any conversations with the police chief to the point of Paul. But the other thing I would say is, I assume that Chuck would have had some discussion points if he were here, but obviously he had a family emergency come up, and, you know, that's changed the picture. So I don't know if, you know, there was an anticipated plan of discussion on this, in fairness to Chuck.
Right.
But you believe Chuck wanted the board to discuss it?
Oh, he did, yes. Yeah, that's why we,
So that's what we're doing, Paul.
Okay, but there's probably more important items in here, and yet those have a firm proposal attached to them. Look, I'm okay personally with 9 to 5 and the 6 to 12 and all of that.
right.
But it just seems odd that, you know, we've been so methodical about this whole process, and then it's like, oh, except for that one, just, you know, whatever strikes your fancy at the moment, go ahead and do it.
I don't think it was quite that.
Well, there's no other, you know, we've had to ferret out what the back conversation was about it all, so if you're comfortable with those hours, I don't have any argument against it. I just hope we don't complete the rest of the process in similar fashion.
The more important thing to me, I see, is the policy of, do we want a 0% community impact fee from laboratories? I would argue
That's a
that.
legit question.
I would argue that we do. But that to me has an order of magnitude more significant impact on the community than who's running a GC at 3 in the morning.
Right. In your case is that because of the nature of the business, there is no real impact, other than, you know, it would be essentially an extortion, right?
I think, exactly.
My word, not yours.
That what we're doing is we're utilizing underutilized commercial and industrial space.
Yeah.
That due to the nature of the business, that there fundamentally isn't a community impact fee as defined by the legislature
Right.
and the Cannabis Control Commission's guidance. Frankly, if we had more of these rather than less, it would not be a bad thing for Littleton.
Right.
And I think the state would agree with that in general, because there's a real shortage of laboratory.
And in fact, they prioritize laboratory licensing to address the shortfall in licensing facilities in the state.
So, Chase, you're okay with that language here, you just wanted to bring it to our attention?
I wanted to bring it to, because if we're going to talk about things that matter, let's talk about that, because that actually matters.
Right, I mean, there's one that I would have said, okay, if there's a couple of candidates for board discussion, that's one, and although I'm in agreement with you and I'm in agreement with the proposal, so, but to your point, yes, that's probably a more important item. Because frankly, the hours issue, if that becomes an issue, we just revisit it the next year, right, or whatever. The term of it is a year, right?
5 years.
5 years?
5
Even
years.
for issues like that, wow.
We could, if you wanted to take another look at it in a year, we could put that in. We could say that the agreement lasts 5 years, but you gotta come back in a year from now and tell us that,
Yeah,
you
there's
know.
gotta be a way to ferret out those simple licensing, it's just, I mean, to make it more uniform with, say, liquor licenses or other things, it's like, okay, we'll give you these hours, if it becomes a problem, guess what, you know, we're not gonna give it to you next year.
We can do that too. We could build in some sort of, we could leave it as is, just 6 to midnight, or we could say, come back in a year and we'll talk about hours again.
I mean, I just don't wanna, I don't wanna be editing the document here as we speak, but we should be, in a general sense, working toward a template that is annualized for renewals, or maybe the terms of the contract are 5 years, but some of the operational aspects.
Yeah, give us the option to revisit it.
I mean, the town does have the ability to terminate this agreement for breach of the conditions contained herein that remain uncured 60 days from the date of notice. I mean, that's pretty extreme, but our opportunity to do something about it if it's not.
So are there any other concerns about this one?
Okay.
No.
And I'm okay with the hours that council was requesting.
So is the board prepared to vote this, to sign this HCA?
I believe we are.
Subject to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
insertions of, I mean, at this point, we wouldn't, I suppose we could fill in the blanks, but I don't know as though that's formal enough, then you'd want initials on each one of those, right?
We could, the board
should
could vote it.
finalize it.
The board
Vote it
could
now and sign it
vote-
later.
Vote it, vote to approve it, subject to
Yeah.
changes discussed tonight to be made by town council, and then you can sign it, I think, offline from a public meeting after that.
Then I move that the Board of Selectmen enter into a host community agreement with G7 Lab LLC, subject to the amendments made tonight and approved by town council.
Second.
Can we,
Sorry.
what were those amendments?
Okay, to specify that the hours of operation will be
6 to midnight?
6 a.m.
6 a.m. to midnight,
Monday through Friday,
Monday through Friday.
right? Monday through Friday, or,
I think they'd like 7 days a week.
Yeah, I thought it was 7
Yeah.
days a
week. Okay.
And then just as a reminder, Shankar's totally fine with the delivery restrictions, which frankly would be the main impact. The equipment will be in an enclosed building, so no one's gonna be allowed in unless they work there and are a local state inspector.
okay.
So I'm going to strike that motion, just give you a clean one,
Yeah.
Chris and Nina. Move that the Littleton Board of Selectmen enter into a host community agreement with G7 Lab LLC as presented to us, with the exception of the amendment to paragraph 6. The company's primary days and hours of operation shall be 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 12 p.m.
Second.
Yeah.
AM.
Thank you.
12 a.m.
Second.
Second.
Motion been made and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Back to CCC.
Yep, would it be helpful if I sort of walked through the agreement, or just, I can answer any questions, whichever you guys prefer.
I appreciate the tour.
Sure. Okay. I think the key provisions are early on, the applicant commits to pay a 3%, a community impact fee that includes, that is equal to 3% of the gross sales of the facility. So that's the amount of the fee. The timing of the fee is that the first payment is going to be paid 60 days after completion of the 12th month of operation. So essentially, they're open for a year. And then 60 days after the conclusion of that first year, they pay the first batch of the community impact fee. From that point on, it shifts to twice yearly that the payment is made, every 6 months after that first year. There will be financial reporting from the applicant to the town in terms of its financial documents to support to demonstrate that the fee that they're paying does equal 3% of the gross sales.
What would be their obligation if they close their doors before a year's up?
If they close their doors before the year is up, that remains collectible by the town. But
Now we get to tangle in bankruptcy court or whatever, huh?
It wouldn't even have to be bankruptcy, just close your business.
Oh, sure.
we would have to go after them in contract to collect that fee.
But the contract covers us in that? All right.
Yep, it's on page 8, under section 12. The last paragraph says that the event the company no longer does business in the town, or in any way loses or has its license revoked by the Commonwealth, this agreement shall become null and void, provided, however, the company shall be responsible for the prorated portion of the annual payment due under section 2 above.
Great, thank you.
There is so there's a reporting requirement in terms of their financial documents. There's a commitment to attempt to hire local vendors and residents in terms of employment. There is a commitment in section 5 that they will pay all local taxes. In section 6, they commit to working with the town's police department on security matters. And then in section 7, we get into the sort of site plan and operational conditions that Chase was referring to earlier. They say that they're gonna do a fence around the property, and it establishes sort of the minimum level of fencing that can be increased or changed by the planning board during site plan and special permit approval. It says that the facility will be limited to the existing size that they proposed. It won't expand or get any bigger without a modification of the agreement. It says that they're not gonna access the facility from the rear of the building. And in section 7D, there is a reservation-only requirement that is imposed on the applicant. And what it says there is that at least 2 months before they open for the first time, they're gonna go in and just talk to the police chief about imposing a initial term during which they're gonna operate on a reservation-only basis. That term is gonna be for at least 2 weeks to start, although if it looks like demand warrants, the police chief can make that initial term longer if he would like to. And the purpose of that reservation-only requirement is to limit initial traffic impacts, lines at the facility, and any crowds that might gather in front of it. This is based on experience that's other towns saw when similar facilities opened up for the first time. And so that reservation-only system will remain in place for a period of time until it gets lifted by the police chief. And then after it gets lifted, if demand ever is sufficient to warrant it again, the police chief could reimpose it. I'll say that when we had some discussion back and forth with the applicant about that reservation-only requirement, they were not wildly enthusiastic about it, but they did agree to it. In earlier versions of our drafting, we had suggested that maybe the reservation-only requirement would be governed initially by the Board of Selectmen. They prefer that that be run through the police department, I think primarily based on questions of efficiency and responsiveness. It's easier, if they think it isn't needed anymore, it's easier, that's an easier conversation to have with the police chief than it is with the whole board.
After the 2 months,
Yep,
and say everything goes as smooth as can be,
yep.
what are the hours of operation then? Is that in here?
This document does not limit their hours of operation. to normal business hours or anything else. We could add that in, but this does not address that.
Have you had any discussions with the applicant to that extent? I know their application included hours of operation, and I recall us saying we might want to revisit that.
I have not been party to those conversations, although Chuck may certainly have had those discussions, but I can't speak to that. If the board, if there are hours the board would like to see, we can, I think, certainly add those in. Or that's something you can defer to the planning board as a condition of their permit, although having just done that for the other applicant just now, we're establishing a precedent that does go in the HCA. So we could certainly do that if the board was so inclined.
I definitely would want some hours spelled out before we voted on it.
Okay, those are the site plan and operational requirements. There are other parts of the agreement. I think in section 10, the town reserves all of its permitting authority, which it would continue to possess anyway, but it's just a section we include. And a lot of the rest of it is, I think, falls into the category of general boilerplate for this kind of agreement. And I'm not sure it makes sense to go through section by section, but.
Can I ask, one of the last sections, the successors and assigned section, unlike liquor licenses, these licenses isn't the right word, but these licenses can't be sold, correct?
There has been seemingly a trend in terms of small local marijuana operators entering into host community agreements with towns and then essentially morphing into a large, another company, essentially. We'll step in and take over the HCA. I'm not sure that that's something that's easily done in terms of the state's licensing, but it has been done in terms of after the execution of the HCA in town. So what section 13 is intended to do is to say that nobody's going to, the party that you've negotiated with and are working with now is going to be the party to this HCA going forward, unless they come back and you specifically approve the transaction.
Right, without our written consent, unless we say, cool, we can go.
And we try to define successor and assigns as broadly as possible. So that's transfer of ownership, that's exchange of shares, that's just about any kind of a succession, corporate succession that we could think of. This is intended to say you can't do it unless they come back in and talk to you first.
Okay. Through the chair, I do have in-depth knowledge on this very topic. So licenses are sold all the time, like as Attorney Heap said, by bigger operators. I would be suspicious of language that said you couldn't sell your company to someone else. If it's the same entity on the host community agreement, the state has a process for a change of control. If the literal letterhead of the company is the same entity, I don't know that the town would have the power to stop or weigh in on whomever was acquiring that entity. That's basic mergers and acquisitions law, and you step into the shoes. It's sort of like moving into an apartment that has a lease. The landlord doesn't get to say, we don't like you, you're a tenant. It's not the purview, it's the purview of the entity itself. And then the state has to bless the people in terms of passing the background check. I know I'm no longer the town's attorney, but that is my 2 cents on the matter. Thank you.
Again, don't we have an agreement on this one?
In terms of?
The subject matter we were just talking about? Okay, so what was that all about?
I just wanted to clarify because I believe that that was not a complete statement.
But you're not
of the law.
representing this
No, I just like to
entity.
be helpful.
Well, confusion is not helpful.
I clarified, sir.
Okay.
So that's.
So that's a quick walk through the HCA and what the applicants agreed to in the HCA. You also have in front of you a separate document from this applicant. This applicant has also committed to an additional payment above the 3% in the amount of an additional 1% of its revenue that is captured in a separate agreement, which you have along with it.
This one right here, Joe? You want that agreement? Had it? There you go.
Got it?
Cindy's got it.
Is that it? Do you need an
Yep.
extra copy?
That's the last.
Did I steal yours?
I have an extra copy.
Did you read through this?
Yeah, I'm also, I gotta recuse myself from this.
This also states 100 hours of community service.
It does.
Where is that language, Joe?
Paragraph 4.
Yeah, and four. Second page. I couldn't find it. Is that what you?
Oh, is this the 2-page?
Yeah.
All right.
That's paragraph 4 on page 2.
Yeah.
And, sorry, well, Joe and Paul are reading through it a little bit. So this doesn't obligate us to spend that money in any particular way, is that
It
correct?
does not. And I guess the only other thing I'd add, just by way of, since we're here talking about HCA's, I think probably have to just raise the general background information that as things exist right now, we're negotiating HCA's with the private applicant, and the only two parties that are really involved in that is the town and the applicant. There was, however, a bill passed by the Massachusetts legislature last week that would give, for the first time ever, the Cannabis Control Commission the authority to look at HCA's and review them. And it's not entirely clear what review means yet, and the bill hasn't passed or become law. But I guess there is we always sort of looked down the road and wondered if the Cannabis Control Commission would involve itself more closely in host community agreements going forward. And the legislation that would give them the authority to do that is looking past a big step last week and is looking more and more likely like it might actually become law. So there's, I'm not suggesting that this affects anything that we're actually doing, but there is some possibility that all of the HCA's the towns are entering into are going to get another level of review after they've already been completed, if that bill does in fact become law going forward.
And this would affect everything retro, every town's HCA's relating to, potentially affect every town's.
It's not perfectly clear whether it would just be, whether there would be some form of
Line in the sand.
line drawn. You know, anything that comes before is okay, and anything that comes after gets the state level review. I tend to think it's probably more likely that it would give them an ability to look backwards at ones that have already come before, but I can't say that for sure. That is just a suspicion on my part.
Please.
Now, to the, I'm sorry.
All right, like just curious, one of the second whereas, which is in both the agreement and both the development agreement and the host community agreement, what's the origin of that? It doesn't seem to, it's like an editorial. Where'd that come from?
The second whereas?
Yeah, the town recognizes this development facility will benefit the town, it says, I don't think we get in, I mean, this is a, a licensing process, and I don't, I don't necessarily know it's going to add additional employment opportunity, What place does this have in a, agreement? Where'd it come from?
That's probably coming from the applicant, and we can certainly take it out if
That's, I mean,
you prefer.
it's fine to hold those opinions, but what's its place in the contract?
I think was probably included in prior HCA's that came before this one.
Well, okay, that's what I'm guessing. Is this just something that, it's like viral?
I think that's probably right.
Well, I would prefer to see that struck from any of these. I mean, let's just stick to business here, I mean, folks see what paragraph I'm referring to? What purpose does it serve? And it's wholly subjective.
It is not necessary to leave that in for any reason that I can think of.
Anticipating the Cannabis Control Commission reopens these, do we have language in here that affords us the opportunity to renegotiate this, should that happen, versus just tear it up and, hey, here we are, sorry about that community impact fee? How does that work? If they were to reopen it and say, we don't like this paragraph?
I attempted to address that in the last minute change just today, and I'm trying to remember where I did that. That language exists in the development agreement in paragraph 5.
Okay.
Second sentence, any term or condition, should be or condition of this agreement, or any application thereof shall to any extent be held invalid, illegal, or unenforceable by a court of competent jurisdiction. It is the intention of the parties that such invalid, illegal, or unenforceable terms or conditions will be modified by mutual agreement of the parties hereto, so as to be brought into compliance with applicable law. So that attempts to say that if anything is found to not work, we will attempt to work something out to replace it.
Anything else from the board?
My only, I guess, concern here is that we only have one agreement in front of us rather than two. And it's hard to Paul's point, we want the language, I mean, aside from the site things, I do agree with you, that we generally want the same structure to these guys. But I also recognize that not all parties are gonna, something of this magnitude and this amount of money on the line are gonna agree to the same terms. So I guess what I'd, before I signed off on this, would really like to see what the other one looks like. I know we have to look at hours. Perhaps with Mr. Giannetta here, we could include a paragraph on hours and get this one done. Notwithstanding my concern about the community impact fee and the applicability of it, I see my concerns reflected here, the concerns that I had expressed to Chris. So I'm generally comfortable with it as it stands.
Yeah, I'm not uncomfortable with the document as it's written too. I am similarly uncomfortable with dealing with them sequentially. One way or the other, you're either handing the unfinished negotiation, okay, all you have to do is beat, here's your starting point, you can go lower than this, and then I don't know what, that would prevent the guy who signed the first one from saying, hey, foul, you gave a different and better deal to somebody else.
Or you're hanging a millstone around somebody else's neck.
Yeah. I mean, the council's earlier point about the hours for the laboratory, you want them to have the same, playing field for hours for labs across the state. I think the same kind of logic applies for licensees here for, I don't know, for now and perhaps laying a baseline for going forward.
Something pertinent to this?
Yes. Chuck hasn't negotiated with me. He presented the board with a fully negotiated HCA agreement for the other applicant before sending me anything from the town. He was canceling meetings, we spoke about this. Not only is it a business disadvantage, it does set precedent to approve an HCA before mine has even been negotiated. It's not fair, and it shows preferential treatment. And I have written a statement that I would really and truly like to read. And I brought my attorney here, and I think that he is going to insist that you let me speak to this issue. It's incredibly important.
The board, have any problem?
Part I feel uncomfortable about is,
It's
I'm
not
sure,
about my-
part I feel uncomfortable about is I think that our board member that we assigned to negotiate this has reported otherwise, and I don't know what the statement's gonna be, but he's not here to defend himself, so I hope you'll exercise some judgment, Mr. Chair, and, cutting it off if it
I
goes in
would
the wrong
expect
direction.
exactly that. I would expect you to.
Okay.
And I am sorry that Chuck isn't here. I know why he's out, and some of you know that the same thing happened to me, and it's terrible. So I really feel for him and his family. But I'm here to request that my HCA negotiations continue with a negotiator other than Chuck DeCoste, ideally an open meeting under public scrutiny. First, I think the appearance of conflict of interest exists here. As you recall, Mr. DeCoste wanted to give a retail HCA to Sanctuary without opening the process to other applicants. And in January, he presented this board with a fully negotiated HCA for an applicant that has a 100% wholesale agreement with Sanctuary, before sending me anything at all. Conflict of interest law in Littleton and in fact, Littleton's own code of conduct for boards requires that public officials must avoid conduct that creates even the appearance of conflict of interest. And the appearance of conflict exists here. Further, in an open meeting, Mr. DeCoste appeared to base a vote on slanderous falsehoods leveled at me by a member of the public and used disparaging and illegally discriminatory language toward me. One might go so far as to consider this malicious abusive process and even tortious interference in contractual relations. At the very least, his actions demonstrated biases that should have disqualified him from conducting negotiations with me. And now, the sticking point in the negotiations is that the town is requesting this illegal community impact fee with no questions asked, with no, they asked specifically in my HCA for me to disregard Massachusetts general law, for instance. And they're with no accountability and no documentation, they expect me to pay this illegal HCA, community impact fee. When this legislation does, and I have read it, when it does pass, it will nullify these HCAs, these illegal HCAs. So it'll just strike that section, and the town risks very seriously the opportunity to recoup its costs for the actual community impacts. by assessing this blanket fee. That's the sticking point. And that's, and the icing on the cake, I shouldn't go into the contract, is that the covenant not to sue. I have to sign an illegal contract and then swear away my constitutional right to legal recourse. That is not negotiating, it's extortion. And it's why I need another negotiator. I need someone who's gonna have a comprehensive look at the statute and have an understanding of what's legal. The town is not allowed to use the community impact fee as a revenue generator. It's against the law, and it will be it will have ripples and recourse. So I urge you not to vote on this HCA. As much as I respect and appreciate the other applicant, it is not fair that one applicant was negotiated preferentially while another wasn't. It's not fair.
Thank you.
Please.
I got to respond to a lot of that. And I think, I don't want to get into specifics because we've been attempting to negotiate these things offline with the applicant. And the negotiations until a moment ago, until 5 minutes ago, I would have suggested that those negotiations were proceeding in good faith with communications on both sides. I certainly, though, take exception to the characterization of the negotiations as extortion, and I absolutely take exception to the characterization of anything the town is asking for as illegal, okay? So we will continue, myself and Chuck, to work with the applicant towards completion of an HCA. But those negotiations remain underway, and we last spoke in a conference call with the applicant last Thursday and resolved that we'd get back to them with another round of revisions by this upcoming Thursday. So we're working on it. We're continuing to work with the applicant, but I don't believe, for my own part, that where we've accomplished a reasonably final HCA with a separate applicant for a separate location, that the ongoing negotiations with this one necessarily form any kind of basis for waiting. That's up to the board. But two separate negotiations, two separate properties, two separate applicants, and two separate negotiations. One getting done quicker than the other is not necessarily an indication that there's anything wrong with this one. But these things happen at different speeds and different paces. I can certainly say, though, that Chuck, to my experience over the past couple months, we're attempting to work with both applicants toward completion of the HCA. Again, they don't always work out at the same time.
Have you been directly involved too?
Yeah.
Yeah. In conversation, yes, okay.
One, through the chair, one conversation with me, in which Attorney Heath
And
referred.
an exchange of drafts with your attorney over multiple iterations.
And during that phone call, Attorney Heath referred to my request for transparency as extreme. It was not ongoing negotiation, it was extremely contentious. There's what the law says, and then there's what the HCA says, and I'm not asking for any special treatment. And my attorney here has obviously copies of the law to share with you. So it's not a matter of me not getting or giving or having any negotiation issues at all. I'm happy to pay for everything, but I'm asking for transparency and the tiny adherence to the law. That's the only thing. And I need another negotiator, and I would be very comfortable having my negotiations occur in open meeting, because sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I think that the public has a right to hear what's going on.
Mr. Chairman, I'm big on process, and I don't want to be the bad guy here, but I think to arm the board with its options, I think that the board doesn't have to continue to take back and forth comments on this subject. I think really probably could terminate the discussion and discuss what the board wishes to discuss to move forward.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make one comment, if I may, Mr. Chair. Clearly, this applicant is uncomfortable with the negotiator that we appointed from this board to work with her and her attorney. And it seems to be that there is concerns over communication. And I'm not going to get into the legal aspects of anything that's gone back and forth because I have that's not my purview whatsoever. But as a member of this board, it is our responsibility. We did appoint somebody to take charge of this task on our behalf. And if we have a member of the community who's coming to us and saying that they're not comfortable and they're not pleased with the process, I feel to some extent that we need to take that request into consideration.
Taking into consideration, but I want to at least hear from what Chuck has to say.
Right.
Which I haven't heard.
Right.
I don't share that unless we had any reason ourselves, other than, dissatisfied other party saying, oh, this isn't working for me. You know.
I'm happy to send
I'm
my
talking to the board,
schedule
thank
of
you.
communication with Chuck.
You don't get to go into a courtroom and say, can I have this judge?
You don't get to make stuff up.
This is, I don't know, this is
I figured I would
bizarre.
just
And it's an insult to Chuck, too, and he's not here, and that's,
Right. I just wanted to, not insulting anybody, just sharing my thoughts on the subject.
And the only other thing I was going to add is, again, I regarded these negotiations as ongoing. And we had a conversation on the phone last Thursday, and we said we would get them another response by this coming Thursday. So as things stand right now, this remains underway. I'm involved. The phone call last Thursday was Chuck, myself, Blake, and Christine. And I'll continue to be involved in these phone calls and communications. So I just wanted to point out that nothing stopped. We're still continuing to work on this.
I'll also say too, the personality issues, aside for a moment, we have a substantive difference in opinion of law. And I guess that, if town council is advising me, I don't know the law. I think the 3% community impact fee is on the line, but also if town council is advising me that's what's being implemented, that seems to me to be the bigger rub in the negotiations. And I don't think any of us are going to request something different than that if that is compliant with the law. Perhaps we will, but I wouldn't. I would still want the 3% and if there are certain expectations with respect to documentation, then the town should take that up on behalf of both applicants. In fact, I expressed some concerns to Chris that the community impact was poorly defined, and now there's a paragraph that defines all of the things that Chris and I could come up with that potentially relate to community impact, everything from grants to the Coalition on Addiction to mental health services, and what is the community impact? If the question is around documentation, that should show up in both applicants.
tell you what my concerns were at the beginning of the evening have only been cemented by what we've experienced here tonight, that we should be working toward a one-size-fits-all template for any of the legal and financial agreements between the town and any of these entities, and that the unique features of, security for a particular site or ingress, egress, all those site-related stuff, that's different and particular to a property, but we're inviting people to assume that somebody got a good deal because, whatever, if they, if any of the terms are different between the two contracts, and I'd be very reluctant to sign on to contracts that were different financially between the two entities. I mean, I'd have to have a pretty good argument as to why that was the case, and be looking to counsel for advice on that. We've already heard one side throwing around, all the legal lawsuit terms. Just wait till that one gets a better deal than the other one, and you'll hear the, threats of suit from the disaffected party.
I have no way to differentiate between these two, except that, I look at it, I've had some questions that I've thrown at Chris on it, but ultimately this is who we've hired to help us sort these things out.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest defining factor to me there was that this is what's being implemented. In other communities, that is, Chris is not on an island in his interpretation of this. And I understand that makes other attorneys uncomfortable, but I'm not a judge
Yeah.
to define the subtle legal differences between them.
And, this is all sort of uncharted water, all uncharted territory, which is not reassuring news. But, the HCA that you have in front of you from the CCC is consistent with a number of HCA's that have been entered into by other towns around the area and have been gone into effect and seem to be working reasonably successfully. None of which is to say that with this kind of new agreement under a relatively still new statute, there's going to be developments in the law as this goes forward. There's almost no case law on any of this stuff yet. Parties to these agreements are going to start to disagree over time and fight about terms. So there will be, everybody's doing the best they can with their understanding of the law as it exists right now. But I would be the first to point out that a lot could change over the upcoming years in this field of law.
Counselor, if we, just like Paul said, I think legally, to make sure things don't happen in the future, we should have identical main parts of the document, so something can't come back to hurt us, because I have more concerns now about the legal nature of everything here by what's going on tonight. So I'm afraid if we don't do something right, then it's going to come back in a legal matter type thing. So is it possible you can keep on working to make the main parts of both documents the same?
The difficulty there is that one of the applicants will not agree, at least at the current stage of the negotiations, to some of the things that are in the other agreement. So the town could say, this is our agreement, this is our form agreement, take it or leave it, sign it or don't. The difficulty is we've been in negotiations with two separate parties, and one has agreed to a version of the agreement that looks consistent with the law, consistent with other agreements that other towns have done, and they're willing to enter into it. But to say that both parties have to do the exact same agreement, one of them currently will not do that. Which is to say that if you handed as I understand it, if you handed the CCC HCA to Littleton Apothecary, at this point in time, they wouldn't do that. So I can't right now get you, the two different parties you're working with signing the same version of the agreement. That is, we could continue to negotiate toward that, but that is not something that right now seems, at this stage of the negotiation, seems realistic.
So that's one way of reconciling them and matching the two agreements. Are there things in what Littleton Apothecary is requesting that could be incorporated into the CCC agreement that CCC would find agreeable enough and would ease Littleton Apothecary's choice to sign? And take that as a rhetorical question,
Yeah, no,
not as a...
That's a great line of communication, but I'd almost want Chris to go off.
And
check
that's why,
whoever-
and that's why I jumped in to say, take that as a rhetorical question, not as a.
And I keep coming back to the idea that that Chuck and I have negotiated the best agreement we could with CCC. And we thought we got it to the point where it was in a form that was as advantageous to the town as we could get it. And that's when we decided we were gonna bring it to you. We continue to have concerns with the other one, and we're gonna continue to work with the applicant on addressing those concerns. But would both parties agree to everything that the other party agreed to in a separate negotiations? I can't say that. And doing that would undo, if we did that right now, that would have the effect of undoing some of what was negotiated in the CCC agreement.
Understood. I'm sorry, guys. My
Yeah,
babysitter's
without getting
gonna
into
turn
specifics,
off.
if that's what it takes to get to a common template, I'd be all for that. And for the reasons that Chase mentioned earlier, I reiterated in a different form, and I acknowledge your opinion that we could probably vote on the CCC, but for reasons of trying not to have very different documents adopted, I would prefer we wait until we're in a position to do both of them.
And just to build on that too, not getting into specific terms between the two agreements, but even just some of the general language that was in the G7 lab, like I mentioned with respect to emergency response plans and things like that, like including that boilerplate language, I think across the board.
Right.
With any of these agreements, just to make them conform. I
The
feel
bad's
it's
on us, I
important.
suppose, for not recognizing the importance of having continuity across the
Right,
board.
right.
But be it as it may, it's, it seems pretty important tonight after having heard what we heard.
Right.
I realize this isn't necessarily the time because the board's deliberating, but for the members at home and the public, I'd just like to mention, anyone who's watching this, there is no executive session exemption that allows the Board of Selectmen to discuss these in executive session and go through some of these nuts and bolts. So I just want to support the board by saying that sometimes these kinds of things have to be fleshed out the way that they've been fleshed out tonight, and there's no other opportunity for the board to flesh them out differently.
Well stated, and probably worth noting, the way we try to accomplish that end is to appoint somebody to go
Right.
off and work with council on it.
Right,
And,
right.
that's, I don't know, my inclination is, with apologies to those that are ready and waiting for an adopted contract, to encourage Chris and Chuck to go back and try to complete the other arrangement. Not gonna be decided tonight, no.
I don't think you don't, if one person has to recuse themselves, you don't have the majority at this point either.
There you go.
Oh.
Chase kind of took it out of my
Well,
hands.
that's
by
not,
leaving.
well, it's the majority of the members present, so theoretically,
That's right.
so I'm mistaken.
Oh.
That almost sounds like a point to take to court in and of itself. Let's not encourage any of that. Let's keep this,
Mr. Gianna, too, just so you know, you came in during discussions, and one of the things I'm concerned about, that, was it 2 weeks, that they, by appointment? I guess what I'm asking, nothing in this agreement right now spells out hours once things get going, and that's one of the things I want spelled out, but, and agreed upon. And I thank you for your patience.
If I may through the chair.
Pardon me?
If I may through the chair.
Sure.
We can come up with hours, but there's nothing that tells me, especially after tonight, that any presentation of hours, any change of language is going to be considered. I mean, I understand the other applicant has her concerns, but I have treated this just as my business that I have now. I treated it just like a business. I pursued Chuck. I provided him with a draft. I didn't receive a draft from town council, nor did I. I provided the draft. I take the initiative. No two businesses are alike. If you and I go to a listing appointment, are we gonna present exactly the same, and are we going to agree to the same terms with our prospective seller? No, we're not, okay? Nor are two separate businesses. We negotiate differently, and I took the initiative. And yes, I provided the hours in the application. I can provide the same hours, or we can have a discussion about them right this second. And I'd like to hear what you'd like to see, because to this point, you know, this was supposed to be a negotiation directly with Chuck and town council. And it has been, a very successful one, a very cordial one. It went fine. You're right, I have been patient. And, you know, I'm at a point where I'm not sure where we go from here. And now I'm hearing that I might as well sit with the other applicant, and I'm not being fresh here. I might as well sit with the other applicant in the same room as her, with town council and with our respective councils. If we're going to sit here and say, let's make two businesses come up with the same agreement, that makes no sense.
That's what we do with liquor licenses every
It's a
time.
different business, with all due respect.
Well, it's only different in that it's new. I mean, beyond that, it's gonna become a routine. And I applaud your initiative, and I appreciate everything you put into it, Dave. I have no complaint of that. And I hope and I assume you'll be whole when this is done. But I also, you know, from the town's perspective, we I think should be mindful of making sure we're not opening ourselves up to a headache down the road with any party. So,
Right.
do I wish you could walk out of here with your license tonight? Sure, but I think that puts us in a bind with the remainder of our what's on our table.
And please don't get me wrong, this is not me stomping my feet saying I want it right now.
No,
That's
no,
not
I
what I'm
get it.
saying.
You've been very, you know,
What I am trying to say, though, is it is like town council said, it's going to be extremely difficult unless we literally hold the two HCA agreements side by side and go right through them and make a determination on how we can make them as similar as possible. Unless we do that, unless we take that action, we won't be similar, and we'll just keep going around and around.
Point made.
Thank you.
So, at least tonight, that's it, as far as this.
yeah, we don't have the people here to vote it through anyway.
What would may I ask, what would the board like to see at its 24th meeting? Has there been, is the board on the same, is there a majority of, I guess, the members present that feel we should go in a specific direction to give some guidance to Chuck and to Attorney Heap? I don't know if you feel it, perhaps the direct question, Mr. Chair, is to Attorney Heap and to see if he has specific questions for this board before we.
Other than, I guess, thank you. I guess other than refining the hours of operation, are there other specific things that you'd want to see
Not,
added to or taken out
Well,
of?
I made my point over and over again, is that I think it's in the town's best interest we get ourselves in a position where, to the extent possible, the financial agreements between the parties are essentially, identical, except, for any specific, property-specific, issue that would warrant otherwise. That being said, if you want Chuck come back and say that's not possible, well, we just have to deal with what we deal with. That's my personal opinion, not the board necessarily.
Mr. Chair, is there public input at all on this today?
Sure has been.
yeah, probably my mistake to open it up like that.
Yeah. This is Gary Wilson, 1 Wilson Lane. So, I was just, I want to disagree with you, Paul, a little bit on this, because it really puts you at a disadvantage in a town, and eventually it could. And in all fairness, you're not being fair to, individuals who would come forward with a business plan. Because if someone comes to you, a corporation that has a ton of money and says, we'll max out everything with the different fees, the smaller business perhaps couldn't possibly do it. So you have to negotiate separately in those agreements. I just don't see how you can possibly, but right now, maybe a year from now, if you're talking about a template where everyone that comes to this town with a business knows you're gonna get hit with a 3%, you're gonna get hit with a 3% impact fee, period. Don't come to us otherwise. Here's the template. We can work the other stuff. This is starting from scratch. We started, Mr. Gianetta came to you with his own HCA, so to force it on another applicant doesn't make much sense, because it wasn't our HCA to begin with. In other words, we didn't create the template. So I think we can get to where you're saying, but as it stands right now, I don't know how you can hold these two parties in that same light.
Well, take it from the other direction though, Gary. You get two of them about, to launch into being competitors in the same business, in the same market. And we have a deal with one and a deal with the other, and we're putting a higher burden on, inevitably, if they're different. One of them, I don't know who it would be, who's gonna get a higher burden than the other one. How is that fair?
Perhaps, but you're not, there's certain things that aren't being incorporated into an HCA because they can't. We understand some of the business plans, I've looked at it. So I see where some of the effects of the idea of creating a board of directors here with this and giving back to the Littleton community in other ways, that can't possibly play out in an HCA because it's not allowed, because it's not part of the business itself. So how does that get incorporated or even thought of when we're negotiating with two different businesses on what one's going to do and the other? I don't see where you could possibly come up with a way to treat them both exactly the same. You're taking away, initially taking away perhaps a business, disparity, and it's great for the town because we're gonna max out everything we can get. But it's not gonna be fair at the end of the day. I think the state's gonna.
Should we negotiate separately with the 3 package store licensees in town?
That was thrown onto you though. What's your negotiating power there? In other words, this is your ground zero with this. You started with 2 separate HCA's. You can't, now if you template it,
All right.
I think it hurts the gentleman behind me because he went through all this effort to create an HCA. And then.
I'll acknowledge that, but at the end of the day, we end up, I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of show a different light because.
Six months after they're both in business and it's all been worked out, I don't know how in the world you defend, we're charging this one this and the other one is that. And then,
It's afterthought. You put someone in charge on your board to do this and created 2 separate.
It's afterthought once we've adopted it. It's not afterthought yet.
Some impacts of the other business.
I just want to add one point for clarification and context, which is that although David may have produced the first draft of the HCA that was shared among the negotiating parties, we reviewed it, we revised it substantially, and when we did that, I think one of the goals was to bring it as closely into compliance with what we see in other towns. At no point in any of this process were we as town council, or I think the applicant, attempting to reinvent the wheel and come up with novel new ways of regulating,
right.
Doing an HCA for a marijuana retail establishment. Our primary goal was to see what other towns had done, implemented, and attempt to capture all of that in one that would work for Littleton as well. So in terms of what this draft, where it came from and what it ultimately attempted to do.
Question I probably should have asked earlier, in that exercise of reviewing other towns, have you found towns where their HCA's vary dramatically from, one licensee to another?
It has to date been more or less standard for the applicant to agree to pay a 3% community impact fee to the town that was hosting the retail establishment.
Okay. And that's the key, having just looked through it recently, there aren't a whole lot of other variable terms in there. It really is the percent.
That's the big one.
Yeah.
I would just put it on the agenda for the 24th. We could do that too, Mr. Gianetta, but that's the way it's gonna be. Bring it back up.
And I assume the board would like to have Attorney Heap present as well?
Yes, please.
Well, and hopefully at that time we'll have a copy of the other proposed HCA. from the other
Hopefully, yeah.
applicant.
I'd like to at least have two on the table.
Yeah.
Committed to continuing to work with the applicant. I
Yeah.
cannot commit to the board that we're gonna have a.
Right, no, that's why I said
anything that-
hopefully.
That Chuck and I
Right.
have agreed to,
Okay.
or that
Right.
that we think is fully ready.
Um,
We're gonna attempt to do our best.
You know,
No, I appreciate that,
And
Chris, I
if it doesn't
understand.
work that way, then it doesn't work that way.
Right.
This is going on too long, you know.
Yeah, all right. And I don't mind saying it, that the draft agreement, if by the next meeting on the 24th, while I'd like to be able to vote on two with very similar language, you're not gonna hold hostage one party forever, but especially with, the information, and Nina was wise to remind us that as much as we'd like to do some of our negotiating offline, we're not really legally allowed to. So I don't mind stating, it sounds like the only real
Oh, okay.
sticking point, or the significant sticking point, is on a percentage to which the other applicant in town has already agreed to, and which is the norm across the state.
That's right.
There you go. Okay. So, I don't know about all this tortious language and
Yeah.
illegal this and whatever else, but they don't want to pay the going freight.
They're hung up on a couple of different
Okay.
aspects of the payment.
Right.
But they have, they've, much of which has dealt with the mechanics of the payment, and the documentation that would go into supporting the making of the payment in the first place. So as the CCC agreement is set up, they pay the town 3%, and that's what they pay. The other applicant is interested in seeing paperwork and costs and receipts up front, which is not something that we see in other agreements that have been entered into thus far. And with the potential of some of that payment reverting back to the applicant after it comes to the town. So there's logistics, I think, is a big part of that negotiation at the moment.
Thanks.
If I may, through the chair,
Real quick,
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding clearly what am I expected to provide to revise my draft as it is today? Hours of operation only?
that's the only concern I had in the whole thing.
Understood.
Unless, I'll leave it to, if Chuck and Chris, in their wisdom, find something, that they want to go back and revisit with you, who knows? But there's nothing on the table as far as that goes.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you in 2 weeks.
Take the morning off. We do have one more item if you want to get to
Oh,
it.
we do?
Yes, the community compact, discussion of grant submissions. Before the board are 3 submitted community compact grant proposals. One is from the finance office, specifically for the chart of accounts update, as you heard a little bit about in our budget meetings. And also, the next after that is from our Parks and Recreation Department with regard to public accessibility. And specifically, developing a plan to identify individual or combined projects that would make the facilities ADA and AAB compliant. And then the last is from the Conservation Department, specifically with regard to some tree planting guidelines and tree planting at the Littleton Common.
And you want us to be the bad guy and pick which one's not going to get the grant.
I will say, it would be particularly difficult for me to provide a recommendation, because I think there's specific policy areas on this that, I don't know if the board has a specific direction it wishes to go into for some of these different components. If the board has more interest in specifically tree planting as an example, then that might be your priority. And before I could give you a recommendation on how we move forward, I'd need to understand what your soft priorities are of the town. The financial one is very black and white. We need to update our chart of accounts at some point. And that some point is either this year or probably next year, would be the I believe the finance director's recommendation. between the other two, and I'm not suggesting that the chart of accounts is one set or otherwise, but between the other two, it's more of a, where do we want to put our resources today? But then again, it could be that we put our resources in the other two today and do the chart of accounts at a later time. So I honestly hope that we'd have more proposals, but seeing as how we have only 3, it's most difficult because now you're only eliminating 1, to be honest.
Can I just ask one question? Littleton Common street trees, do they mean the trees on the common, or do they mean trees in the common area? This
suppose
doesn't
we could get-
pertain to the issue that was brought before us by the Shade Tree Committee, does it?
I was assuming it did.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to clarify.
Right, task 2 is for tree installation, and specifically the Shade Tree Committee's request of a budget of $5,000 to plant trees in the Littleton Common. They went on, the conservation coordinator went on to say that the city of Quincy has used this community compact grant specifically for tree planting. So a portion of this could be utilizing those funds for tree planting.
Okay.
The other, I mean, in,
So we know that we've been told that the trees, some of the trees on the common are gonna die,
Yep.
and we're trying to establish
All
a
of it back,
schedule.
It's just a question of when.
I know. We're trying to establish a schedule to replace those trees without clear cutting the whole common and having to replant them all 50 years from now, so,
I've got a thought. Trying to use our goals as a guideline.
yeah,
Common was one of the master plan goals, implementation of that, so I mean, I would think that rises up. Chart of accounts, especially given the history of what we just went through with the finance,
right.
is probably.
Yeah,
a good
financial
idea.
practices was one of our goals as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And the
improving-
third one, sounds like it has great merit, but it's the first time I've seen it on our radar screen, and I assume there's nothing that prevents us from going after that next year, right?
no, I mean, I don't think you may not have, access to community compact grants next year, but perhaps the following year, or other funding sources.
Okay,
But, again, those are
right.
decisions made on the fly. I'd almost think that it only makes it worse, prolongs the pain, have the people come in and make their pitches on each of them.
You could certainly do that, and honestly, one of our
No,
departments,
the chairman, not does that.
Well, we already met with the Shade Tree Committee,
Right.
sure.
yeah. And I know that they followed up with Chris Stoddard, and we're working on devising a plan, but this is just to help fund it, so.
Then the final option would be to give it some thought and not make a decision tonight, make a decision at a future meeting. Of course, that's not me also trying to punt it to a meeting I won't be here for, but that was just
I'm
saying.
prepared to make a decision on something tonight. We might as well move something.
Right.
I would say, as I just said a moment ago, I think we have rationale to support doing the chart of accounts and the shade tree now, and, that's not a negative on the other one. It's just in the order of priority. If we're only able to do 2 a year, those two are, items that have been on our radar for a while in some form or fashion, consistent with our adopted goals, and
Right.
I'd opt for, what is that, submit the proposal A and proposal C, is that how they
Sure.
listed?
Yeah.
Okay. And those are meant to mean the chart of accounts and the trees.
Right.
So I'll move that the board authorize the town administrator to submit the Charter of Accounts proposal and the shade tree proposal as the town of Littleton's 2 community compacts for FY 2020, and to sign associated grant applications on behalf of the board.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Make a motion to adjourn?
Unless our
Oh.
new guests have anything to...
We were here to listen about the trees, so.
Perfect.
Yes, it is, exactly, it's her name.
You are the Lorax, you speak for the trees?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
No, it's just a lot, a lot of trees are impacted, it's kind of alarming how many trees are impacted.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Good timing.
Yeah, seriously.
Should have come earlier, it was a
I
lot
know,
more fun.
right?
We would have loved to have been.
Would have been happy to trade places with you tonight,
Yeah,
frankly.
no, we just adjourned.
Well, I want to adjourn, but we had people watching over us outside today. Where? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yeah,
Motion.
second.
Second, okay, yeah.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.